Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku and Uraraka shared a moment of comfort part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, DevilTito from WhatIf. So let's start the video. It had been over a week now since Izuku started waking up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. Usually he would be covered in sweat, left as a mark of his constant nightmares. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Midoriya Izuku was frequently suffering from nightmares. In his dreams, he would most often see his friends and his mom captured and tortured by villains while he was forced to watch. Other times, he would dream that All Might was suffering a slow and painful death, while he could do nothing to help, and sometimes the dreams would be about himself. Those dreams were in some way the worst. Not that the dreams about his friends didn't leave him shaking and unable to function for hours at a time, but his fear of his and All Might's secret being discovered was on a whole other level. He was scared of what would happen. How would he be able to protect those dear to him if something happened to him? Izuku would always wake up and let one for all course through him, and let the feeling of immense power at his disposal lull him into a sense of security. This time, he had relived the training camp, but his arms had been severed off and he could do nothing as his classmates were murdered in cold blood. Izuku felt sick to his stomach and decided to get a glass of water for his parched throat. The sweat made his clothes stick to him, and for a few moments he debated whether to go downstairs and take a shower or just change once he stopped sweating. Finally, after he had downed a glass of ice-cold water he kept in his fridge, he rummaged around for a clean t-shirt and another pair of shorts. A few minutes later Izuku found himself creeping down the hallway and heading for the elevator. He tried his best to make no sounds and prayed to the gods that he didn't wake up 𝗃𝗄𝗵𝗲 or 𝗳𝗵𝗲. Or even worse, 𝗵𝗃𝗲. The perverted teenager would most definitely insinuate that he was trying to break into the girl's room, or harass him about why Izuku was showering in the middle of the night. He didn't feel like being questioned by 𝗃𝗄𝗵𝗲 either and just hurried along to hallway. Luckily no one came charging at him, demanding where he was going at this time of the night. Breathing a sigh of relief, he pressed the button for the elevator and waited patiently. The dorm was so peaceful at this time, and Izuku found himself hoping he could spend his nights as calmly as he felt now. The fear that usually lingered after his nightmares had dissipated and didn't feel as tense anymore. The elevator doors opened with a ding and closed again after he entered. Izuku rolled his shoulders while he waited for the doors to open again. Maybe I should go running when I wake up? He was seriously considering exercising despite knowing how exhausted he was going to become morning. He finally exited the elevator and headed straight for the baths. That was another thing Izuku had started doing lately, relieving stress through exercise and training. He wasn't pushing himself. He knew that his teachers all kept a close eye on him, and he honestly didn't want to make anyone worry. He just wanted to burn off some excess energy and clear his head. Izuku decided that he would see how he felt in the morning. Once Izuku reached the bath, he stripped down and jumped into the nearest shower cubicle. He waited for a second while the water warmed up and then stepped under the jet of hot water. Another sigh of relief left him as he washed away all his worries. The water felt great as it ran down his shoulders and back, loosening up his stiff muscles. It was just a dream. I'm safe here. We even have guards outside the building. Nothing can happen here. Izuku repeated to himself, soaking in the warmth of the water. He quickly rinsed his hair and body, but stayed under the running water for a couple more minutes. He was finally calm again. Once dressed, Izuku headed back into the lounge area and stopped short when he noticed a familiar head of brown hair sitting in one of the sofas. Not wanting to scare her, Izuku approached from the side where Uraraka could easily spot him softly calling her name. "Uraraka-san? Are you all right?" His concern for her grew when he saw that her knees were tucked close to her chest and her body was trembling slightly. She hadn't heard him yet, so he cautiously reached out a hand to touch her shoulder. Normally, he wouldn't have initiated physical contact and would just wait for her to reply, but her unresponsiveness was worrying him. The second Izuku's hand made contact with her skin, she jumped and let out a startled noise. Her eyes darted up to his and the sight made his heart ache. She was scared. "Deku-kun, I didn't hear you, sorry. She mumbled her apology and looked away rather stiffly. Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you like that. Is something wrong? Izuku tried again and waited for her answer. He could tell that she was upset and needed to talk to someone, but he didn't want to pressure her into talking. I couldn't sleep so I came down here. Her usual cheeriness was back, but Izuku could tell right away that it was forced. She was trying to be brave and not worry him, but he could see the uneasiness right below the surface. I couldn't sleep either. Izuku offered a small smile, hoping Uraraka would see it as an invitation to continue the conversation. For a second he thought she wasn't going to reply, but when she finally did he wasn't put at ease anyhow. I see. Uraraka returned to her previous position and hugged her knees close to her, protecting herself. Izuku decided to stay with her for a while and make sure she was okay. It was late and she should really be getting some sleep. Sitting down on the sofa next to her with a good bit of space between them, Izuku wondered how to get the conversation started. He opted for a direct approach. Did you have a nightmare? He asked softly. From her stiffening of her body, Izuku guessed that he was right. She seemed to struggle with herself on whether to admit it or not and finally gave up with a sigh. She nodded mutely. Me too. They were quiet for a few minutes, letting the silence engulf them. Only one of the small lamps near the TV was on, and its light was so weak that they could barely see each other. Izuku was fine with it being dark. That way, he wouldn't continuously glance in his friend's direction. Uraraka shifted slightly on the sofa, still not looking directly at him. I've been having them for a few days now. Once I wake up, I can't go back to sleep. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but he caught every word of it. Have you been coming down here every time? Izuku wondered how many hours of sleep she had missed this week. Now that he thought about it, she had been awfully tired when they had classes and had barely been able to focus. No, just today. Her reply told him that she usually stayed in her room, alone and wide awake. Izuku tried not to let it get to him. He did the same exact thing very often. My mom used to say that there was only one way to chase away a bad dream. Hot chocolate. Izuku remembered all the times he would wake up and run to his mom's bed when he was little. She would always comfort him and make hot chocolate for both of them, before staying with him until he fell asleep. Right now, he was hoping to give Uraraka some of that same comfort. Judging by how she perked up, it seemed like it had worked. Izuku offered to make some and she gratefully accepted. They had settled into the kitchen and Izuku was rummaging around for the ingredients he needed. The kitchen was rather large and held personal cupboards for every resident along one wall and 4 large refrigerators that were stocked up twice a week by UA on the opposite. 4 long kitchen stations like the ones seen in competitive cooking shows were aligned in 2 rows in the middle of the room, and beyond those were dining tables. It had been a while since Izuku had made hot chocolate and he was a little nervous about the outcome, but he was determined to whip up an amazing beverage for Uraraka. She had stopped trembling, but her expression was still somber. She was occupying one of the chairs that she had dragged in front of the counter Izuku was working at. She hadn't mentioned the source of her nightmares, but Izuku was nearly certain they originated from all the villain attacks. My mom would always put marshmallows in my cup, but I don't think we have any here. Izuku mumbled as he stirred the pot with warmed-up milk. He tried looking for whipped cream or sprinkles, anything really that could go into the hot chocolate, but he didn't find any. That's okay, Uraraka whispered meekly. Her face wasn't as pale as earlier, but she still looked a bit frazzled. Izuku frowned as he observed her for a few moments. She was really starting to worry him and he sincerely hoped the hot chocolate would improve her mood. Mom also says that it helps to talk to someone about your bad dreams. Izuku gauged her reaction carefully. She looked like she wanted to say something, but decided against it and shook her head instead. Izuku interpreted that she didn't want to talk about it, so he racked his brain for a way to change the subject, but she beat him to the punch. You must be close with your mother. Uraraka finally looked Izuku in the eyes, a hint of curiosity in her voice. He nodded with a small smile and sifted in the cocoa powder along with a chunk of butter. Adding sugar and a pinch of salt, Izuku handed Uraraka a steaming mug and grabbed one for himself as well. It had been a little over half an hour since he ran into her, and the exhaustion was easy to spot on her face. It's always been me and my mom. I didn't really have any friends before now, so she was my go-to person. Izuku admitted sheepishly. He was glad that he had a good relationship with his mother and he was proud of the way she had raised him. Do you miss your parents, Uraraka-san? The thought had occurred to him when he first spoke of his mom. Uraraka had been living alone for a while now, but surely she had some way of getting comforted by her parents that she was missing now. Yes. Her voice was low, so Izuku guessed that her nightmare had been about them. She took a slow sip from her mug and her eyes shot open. This is amazing, Deku-kun. She took another sip and let the taste linger for a while. She had felt so cold just minutes before, but now she was starting to heat up from inside. This is my mom's secret ingredient, hot chocolate. He explained as he took a large gulp of his own. It had turned out good, but his mom's was even better. Maybe he should bring Uraraka to his mom's house and have her try the original drink. It's yummy. Uraraka cupped her hands around the mug and warmed her fingertips. Taking a few more sips, she looked over at her companion who was staring intently into his mug. If Uraraka were to guess, she would say that Izuku was picking apart the recipe in his mind and adding twist to it. You're mumbling inside your head again, aren't you? She asked, and a genuine smile finally crept onto her face. Izuku's eyes snapped up and his cheeks flushed a bit from embarrassment, but his features relaxed when he saw Uraraka's smile. It's an old habit. He sheepishly laughed, glad that she was seemingly feeling better. Then it was her turn to stare into her now empty mug. What's the secret ingredient? She had tried to figure it out because it tasted familiar, but she couldn't place her finger on what it was. Peanut butter. Izuku beamed at her and launched into an explanation of how the monosaturated fat was better for the health compared to other fats and how peanut butter was filling and high in protein, so it was actually a very versatile ingredient and he preferred it as a snack together with some vegetable sticks. Thank you. Uraraka stopped his rambling by patting his hand affectionately. She was feeling a lot better and she was so grateful that Izuku had stayed with her instead of leaving her alone. Why, you're welcome. It's what anybody would have done, he answered, face flushing again. Uraraka found that Izuku easily got embarrassed when he received praise, but she liked this humble and flustered side of him. A yawn escaped her and she realized just how late it was. Luckily, they didn't have classes the following morning, so she could sleep in. Izuku saw her yawning and started to clean up as fast as he could without making too much noise. He knew that it was unlikely that anyone would hear him from a floor below, but it felt odd to make noise in the middle of the night. Uraraka jumped off her seat and quickly helped him put things away after washing them. They were quiet while they worked, but neither of them minded. After they tidied up the kitchen, they headed for the elevator to return upstairs. Izuku stopped a few meters away from the doors and looked up at her with something like determination in his eyes. Uraraka-san, when you have nightmares and don't want to be alone, you can always text me. I know what it feels like to be terrified of falling back asleep, so it's okay to depend on me and the others. Even if you just want to sit beside someone without talking, just come find me and I'll be there. Uraraka was surprised that Izuku's voice had been clear and he hadn't stuttered once. Then she realized what he had said to her and she was overwhelmed with emotions. Izuku seemed to notice it as well and immediately regretted opening his mouth. He had wanted to reassure her that she wasn't alone, not make her feel bad about having nightmares. He started panicking and tried to talk his way out of it, but he noticed that she wasn't mad at him or upset. She just looked taken back. Thank you, Deku-kun. I'll try. Her voice cracked at the end. She didn't deserve such an amazing friend, but she would always appreciate him, she promised herself. When Izuku had returned to his room, he couldn't stop thinking about Uraraka's nightmares. He knew that the two of them weren't the only ones affected, but none of the others had spoken up about having nightmares or other problems, so maybe they were handling it themselves. Back to the problem at hand, Izuku was contemplating what he could do for Uraraka. He hadn't really confided in anyone about his own nightmares, so it was unlikely that she was going to accept professional help. Well, at least not right away. There must be something I can do for Uraraka-san. Izuku racked his brain for so long that he actually fell back asleep for what felt like an hour, but turned out to be 5. The next time he woke, sunlight was filtering in through the window and his clock read 7:32 a.m. Rubbing his tired eyes, Izuku sat up in bed and yawned. He had slept fine the second time around, and the solid 5 hours had left him feeling more refreshed than he would have thought. As he swung his legs out of bed, he grabbed for his phone to check if his mom had texted him as she usually did, and he was surprised to see an additional text from Uraraka. "Thanks for staying up with me last night. The hot chocolate made me fall right back. Sleep." As always, her text included various emojis and left a smile on Izuku's face. Then it suddenly occurred to him why he had been so affected by Uraraka's behavior that night. She was usually so expressive in anything she did, so it had freaked him out a little that she had been almost stone-faced. Izuku shook his head to get rid of the thoughts and typed a quick reply before getting up and starting his day. On his days off, he would usually visit his mom and even spend the night at home, so the green-haired teenager got dressed for his morning workout and headed downstairs to see if any of his friends were up yet. He usually worked out first thing in the morning and then ate a big, healthy breakfast. Lately, Ida had joined him on his morning runs, where he tried to match Izuku's pace, or rather, where Izuku tried to keep up with the engine quirk user. They had been practicing cutting corners at high speeds, and the class president was slowly, but steadily improving. "Maybe I should ask Uraraka-san to join us. The extra exercise might be able to help her sleep better." Izuku was waiting patiently for the elevator to arrive while going over his workout routine in his head. He was supposed to report his progress on quirk control to All Might the following day and had planned to hit the gym after his run. The elevator finally dinged open and he left the floor and was out the door after greeting the few early risers. After a successful workout, Izuku returned to his room and showered. Their personal bathrooms weren't the most spacious, so he preferred showering in the shared bath, but after an intense workout he would rather wash up in the privacy of his own room. Meanwhile, Uraraka had been having breakfast with the rest of the girls save for Mina, who was a heavy sleeper. She had woken up when her stomach had growled loudly and demanded a sacrifice, so she had groggily gotten out of bed and started her morning routine. She had grabbed some yogurt from her fridge and finished it while she read the news and checked her social media. Ochaco had forgotten to check the daily coupons and weekly deals before bed last night, so she was absent-mindedly scrolling through her favorite money saver app. She rose to check the contents of her fridge and decided to buy some groceries later that day, but first she would gather up some of the girls and see if anyone wanted to join her. Ochaco's shoulders still felt stiff from the previous night and she rolled them a few times to loosen them up. She could really use a massage. She had slept better than expected despite having been up half the night. Ochaco remembered the hot chocolate 𝗵𝗃 had made for her and decided she would buy some peanut butter and try to recreate it. That way she could treat him to some of her own if she ever returned the favor. She felt a rush of warmth as she recalled the worried glances he had sent her. She really was lucky to have such an amazing friend. Not only had he been worried about her, he had also stayed and taken care of her even though he didn't know what to do for her. She had been grateful for the company and had slowly forgotten her dreams and just listened to him talk. Ochaco unlocked her phone and texted him, hoping that he wasn't woken by her text. It was a little past 7 in the morning, so it wouldn't have come as a surprise if he was still asleep. The brunette assumed that was the case since he didn't reply within 10 minutes. She had already changed and was about to fix her hair when her phone buzzed. "You're welcome. Let me know if I can do anything for you." "I mean it." Ochaco smiled at her phone and hummed a tune as she left her bedroom in search of a proper meal. Once she was downstairs, she joined Momo and Toru, who were already eating, and greeted the others who were present. Kirishima was one of the few early risers and as always, he greeted Ochaco energetically. He was busy watching a show on the TV and she didn't want to disturb him while he had the TV to himself, so Ochaco had busied herself with preparing her meal. She had only just grabbed some food and sat down when 𝗵𝗃 walked by and greeted everyone. He sent her a warm smile before hurrying out the door to start his workout. Ever since they had moved into the dorms, he had been very consistent with his training. Always the diligent worker, isn't he? Momo watched her dorky classmate leave and returned her attention to her half-eaten breakfast. She wondered if 𝗵𝗃 ever skipped a workout or just rescheduled his entire day to get one in. "Makes me feel like I don't do enough," Ochaco sheepishly admitted. She had really admired 𝗵𝗃's spirit and work ethic and honestly felt like she was lacking determination. "I know," Momo chuckled. He was so busy preparing for the provisional exam that he forgot his own birthday 3 weeks ago. Being vice president for Class A meant that Momo knew a lot of personal information about each of the students. She had, of course, obtained a lot of that info by befriending the class, but birthdays and the like she knew from her position. Birthday? Birthday? How could I forget? Ochaco nearly smacked herself. She had been so busy with exams, settling in, nightmares, internships and 100 other things that she completely forgot about his birthday. She was supposed to be one of his best friends, for crying out loud. Uraraka-san, you've had a lot on your mind. I'm sure Midoriya-san knows that too. Momo tried to reassure her, suddenly feeling bad for bringing up his birthday. Uraraka looked bewildered and the vice president could almost hear the gears turning in her head. I know. But Deku-kun always goes out of his way to help others, and I want to do something nice for him. Ochaco had thought of what present to get him in less than 30 seconds. Now she was trying to determine whether she should get him a cake or maybe bake him one. Also, should she enlist the help of Midoriya's other friends or should she just do it by herself? The questions popped up in her head faster than she could answer any of them. Ochaco's head was spinning and the fatigue from her nightmares was starting to take its toll on her. She hadn't even noticed how tired she was feeling, but she had to hurry up and decide what to do. She knew Midoriya was going to visit his mother later, so she could always surprise him when he came back. Ochaco thought about her options and decided that she would surprise him by herself. 1. She didn't want to risk him getting overwhelmed by having so many people suddenly celebrate him. 2. She wanted to repay him for his kindness and all the support he gave her. Alright, I know what to do. Ochaco steeled herself and hurriedly finished her food before finding a pen and paper so she could write down what she needed to do. Izuku was sitting on the couch with his mom after having spent most of the day back home. Inko had been adamant that he visit whenever he could, but only if his homework was already completed. She wanted Izuku to push himself academically, but she also wanted to see him as often as she could. She wouldn't outright tell him, but she missed him so badly. Inko had felt incredibly lonely after Izuku moved out, but she didn't want to burden him with such feelings. She just wanted to support her baby. Izuku? Is something on your mind? She had asked him after dinner. He had been his usual happy self, but sometimes a worried look would creep onto his face, but he would quickly dismiss it. I guess? Izuku briefly considered telling his mom about Uraraka's nightmares, but if she found out what they stemmed from, she would figure out that Izuku also had them and she would forbid him from staying at UA. Well, maybe not, but she would find him a therapist and have him undergo treatment. Also, he didn't want to betray Uraraka's trust, so he stalled. Mom, do you have some more recipes for quick and healthy meals? I've been making the same 2 dishes the whole week and I would like more options. It was not a lie that he had wanted to ask about recipes. He wholeheartedly missed his mom's cooking, but that wasn't what had been on his mind. He felt a little bad about not being honest with her and he desperately wanted her advice on his situation, but he decided he would wait until Uraraka approved. He hoped she would. His mom gave excellent advice and maybe Uraraka would be willing to meet with her and then have an adult to talk to. Of course. How have you been keeping up with your meal plan? Inko got up from the sofa and hurried into the kitchen where she stashed all her cookbooks and personal recipe collections. She even had one from when Izuku was in preschool and it was filled with 5-year-old Izuku's favorite dishes. Ida-kun suggested that we each cover our own breakfasts and lunches, but for dinner we could form teams of 4 and each team could prepare dinner for the rest once a week. That way, we get a more balanced diet instead of having pizza delivered every other day and we also get to strengthen our bonds and teamwork. On weekends we can make whatever we want, but Ida-kun and Yaoyorozu-san, the vice president, are compiling some ideas for those that actually want to cook for themselves and I thought I could pitch in with some of your recipes. His stream of words finally came to an end and Inko looked at him, beaming with pride. It sounds like you all get along well. Inko smiled lovingly. She was so happy that Izuku finally had real friends that understood him and helped him every day. She could easily see how much his friends had impacted him. He was much more comfortable around people and although his nervousness still hadn't faded completely, he was able to live with his class. It's surprisingly fun to live together. But that doesn't mean my friends have replaced you, Mom. Izuku backpedaled quickly, even though he knew his mom didn't think like that. He still had a guilty conscience when it came to his mom, and he would be damned if he let her think she didn't matter to him. Inko was a little surprised that he was so earnest. She couldn't help but feel another surge of pride when she looked at her son. He was growing up to become a fine man. A fine man who would miss the train back to the dorm if he didn't hurry up. Izuku had arrived back at the dorm in the evening. He was happy that he had spent the day at home, but he was also glad to be back. The dorm was really starting to feel like home these past few weeks. He could hear heated arguments coming from the TV lounge, and he walked over, a little curious to find out what the commotion was about. He was surprised to find most of the boys gathered, all focused on the TV screen. It took Izuku a second to figure out that they were playing video games, and from the sound of it someone was cheating. Kirishima and 𝗧𝗍 were each holding a controller and were more or less smashing the control buttons while screaming profanities at each other and the game. The rest of the boys were just as lively and were either arguing about superior techniques or complaining that it was their turn to play in the tournament. Kaminari noticed him approach and quickly waved him over, asking him to join. Why is there a scorch mark on the coffee table? Faint traces of burnt wood reached his nose, and Izuku already had a guess to what had caused them. Oh, 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 got his ass handed to him by 𝗧𝗍, so he is sulking in his room. Izuku couldn't believe his own ears. He almost wished he had seen how it happened, but when he thought about Kaken's temper, he was glad he hadn't witnessed it. Kirishima's sudden yell of outrage indicated that he had lost the match. Come on, Midoriya. It's your turn against 𝗧𝗍. Kaminari tried persuading him despite Izuku's protests that he sucked at video games. Putting his stuff down, he finally gave in, and after receiving a rundown of the game and how to play, he tentatively played against 𝗧𝗍. The tape user was skilled, but Izuku's ability to analyze situations and think up strategies on the spot was unrivaled. After losing the first round of the match, Izuku wiped the floor with 𝗧𝗍 in the second one and only lost the final round after he accidentally pressed the wrong button. 𝗧𝗍 won by a hair and sighed in relief when his victory was announced. Sweat had gathered on his forehead and he wiped it away while asking Izuku how he had taught up his combinations. Midoriya loses. Next up is 𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗃. Kaminari announced, having taken on the role of a commentator for the tournament. Izuku removed himself from the scene and went to pick his bag up. 𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗃 took Izuku's seat and turned his attention to the match. Is 𝗧𝗍 the champion? Izuku asked. It seemed that half of the boys from the class had lost to 𝗧𝗍, judging from how they cheered when 𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗃 landed a powerful hit. Among the boys, no one comes close to beating 𝗳𝗂𝗄𝗏. You can't even see what combos she uses before you have been crushed. Kaminari replied, his eyes still glued to the screen. They had all been astonished when 𝗳𝗂𝗄𝗏 and Jiro had joined the tournament earlier in the evening, but the invisible girl had taken advantage of her quirk and eradicated all her opponents in a breeze. After several rematches, the girls had left to join the other females in the class and a new tournament had started. Izuku stayed for a few more minutes, amazed at how well 𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗃 held his own against the current champion. Then he remembered that he had to refrigerate the leftovers his mom had handed him, so he made his way upstairs to his room. It was already dark out and Izuku considered turning in early, but his decision was put off when Uraraka texted him, asking if he was back yet. She apparently had something to show him. 2 minutes later, there was a knock on his door and he let the gravity manipulator in. She was carrying a white box and another package wrapped in sparkly paper. Izuku was confused, but waited for her to sit down and explain. What did you want to show me? He asked curiously, guessing it had something to do with the boxes in her arms. She placed the white box on his table and pushed the smaller package toward him. Well, earlier today it struck me that we never celebrated your birthday because of the provisional license exam, so I thought we could celebrate today. Ochaco conveniently left out that she had forgotten all about it and removed the lid from the white box, which revealed a birthday cake complete with frosting and the number 16 writing with chocolate on it. Izuku's mind went blank. Yamamoto? It had been a few hours after breakfast when Ochaco came up to the vice president. Momo looked up from her book and noticed that Uraraka had a few specks of flour spattered across her cheek and sleeve. Yes? Uraraka was looking intently at her and it was a little unnerving, if she was entirely honest. Your quirk allows you to create things you know the molecular makeup of, right? The gravity user asked, intensity in her eyes increasing. That's correct. Why? Momo couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. Had Uraraka spotted some weakness she might have? Well, if you knew the makeup of food or dessert, would you be able to create it? And would it be edible? Uraraka asked, and her question shocked Momo. Theoretically speaking, yes, but I don't think it would be edible. There are a lot of food additives and aromas that need to be accounted for in processed food, but for raw ingredients I think the nutritional value would be 0, since it technically is artificial. Momo answered. She had never actually tried to eat anything she created, but maybe she should look into it. If she succeeded, it would become an incredibly useful skill in the future. The challenge excited her, and she immediately started jotting down ideas for things to create. Oh, I see. Ochaco left Momo alone, a little disappointed. Now she would have to find another way to obtain an endless supply of snacks. He was at a loss for words. In front of him was Uraraka with a cake and a present for him. Never in a million years would Izuku have seen that coming. He had no idea how to react, so he was left gaping at her like a fish. That was pretty much how he felt at that moment, like a green-haired fish out of water. Izuku tried to say something, say anything, but he barely managed to make a sound. Tears had gathered in the corner of his eyes, and Uraraka was waiting for his response, head tilted slightly. Come on. Say something. She brought you a freaking cake, at least thank her. Izuku's mind was going into overdrive, but he just couldn't get any words to pass his lips. He tried to calm down and speak properly, but his hands were shaking and the tears were blurring his vision. Are you okay? Uraraka asked him. She had expected him to be surprised, but she wasn't prepared for the tears that were starting to fall from Midoriya's eyes. Had she upset him by suddenly declaring that they would celebrate his birthday? No, that couldn't be the case. Midoriya wouldn't get upset over someone else doing something nice for him. Unless he wasn't upset, but touched by her gesture. That would make sense. From what she had gathered the past few months, Midoriya hadn't had many friends before high school, and she wondered if anyone aside from his mom had celebrated with him before. It's the first time someone has wanted to celebrate me. I'm so happy you didn't have to. Izuku finally managed to choke out. He couldn't believe that Uraraka had done something so nice for him. She was looking puzzled at first, but then a small smile formed on her face and her eyes softened. Happy belated birthday, Deku-kun. She passed him the small package and encouraged him to open it right away. She wanted to see his reaction when he saw what she had picked out for him. The choice had been easy. What better to get a hardcore hero fanboy than some good, sturdy notebooks for his hobby? The sound that left Izuku could be described as a cross between a gasp and a yell. His fingers had carefully opened the package in front of him and had revealed a set of 2 thick notebooks and a pack of pens. Izuku picked one of the notebooks up in disbelief. The one in his hand was plain black with a soft leather cover, and the second one on his bed was gray with a woven fabric cover and a black elastic band that held it closed. Both felt amazing to the touch. The pack of pens consisted of 4 different colors of erasable ballpoints. What do you think? Ochaco asked excitedly. She had seen the way his eyes lit up, and he had immediately run his fingers along the spine and across the covers. His gaze met hers, and she was taken aback from the intensity of his eyes. It's amazing, but you didn't have to get me something so expensive, Uraraka-san. You even brought a cake to boot. Izuku was aware of her financial situation and felt bad that she had spent so much money on a gift for him. Ever since starting at UA, Izuku had gone through his notebooks like it was nobody's business, and he barely had any pages left in his current one. Don't worry, I got it as a bundle so it was cheaper, and the salesman gave me an additional discount for students. The brunette proudly told him. Ochaco's coupon game was incredible, and she always found the best deals. She had also made the cake from scratch, so she was excited for Midoriya to try it. Thank you so much. Izuku flipped open the black notebook and noticed that one side was plain paper and the opposite side was ruled. That way he could draw on one side and write his notes in an orderly fashion next to it. Izuku smiled so brightly that he would have given All Might a run for his money. Ochaco sighed in relief as her best friend happily started rambling about how he was going to put her gift to use. Did you make the cake yourself? Izuku had thought ahead when he moved in and had bought disposable tableware and paper cups in case he didn't want to eat in the common room. His decision now came in handy and he got up to grab 2 paper plates and cups as well as a knife and 2 forks. I hope it tastes good. Uraraka was scrutinizing her work and accepted the plate and drink Izuku handed her. She took a sip of the fizzy drink he had gotten out from his fridge. I'm sure it does. Izuku carefully sliced the cake and placed 1 piece on Uraraka's plate and the second on his own. It had a layer of jam under a layer of cream and the buttercream frosting spread all over the top and sides. The birthday boy dug his fork into the cake and tried a bite. It was delicious, he told her. I'm glad you like it. Ochaco's smile made butterflies flutter in Izuku's stomach. This was how she was supposed to be. Always cheerful, undeniably kind and able to make Izuku sweat. He went for a second bite of cake and started asking questions about how she had baked it and if she could show him sometime. They stayed like that for over an hour, eating cake and talking. Izuku wasn't sure if she had eaten dinner yet, so he offered her some of the food his mom had made him bring back. She politely declined, stating that she had eaten enough cake batter to keep her going for days. It was Sunday evening and Uraraka left saying she had to look over her homework for classes tomorrow. Izuku thanked her countless times during the evening and again when she left his room. She gave him a little wave as the elevator arrived, and just when Izuku was about to close his door, he looked to the side and noticed 𝗵𝗃𝗄 poking his head out of his room, giving Izuku a thumbs up. Izuku closed the door behind him and looked at the remaining cake on his coffee table. The butterflies returned. Monday morning came fast and everyone groggily started another week of classes and hero training. Izuku was scheduled to be at 𝗍𝗍𝗏's office both Tuesday and Wednesday and had already notified the teachers as well as completed his school work beforehand. The internship was taken more out of him than he had expected, but not once did he complain. To Izuku, being taken in by 𝗍𝗍 was a dream true. There was something ecstatic about being acknowledged by someone who used to be the only sidekick of his mentor. This, of course, also meant that he had to prove his worth, but Izuku was already used to putting in all his effort in anything he did. Plus ultra, right? The first class passed in a blur, so did second and third period, and eventually it became lunchtime. Izuku headed to the cafeteria with the rest of his class and bought his lunch. Ida had been telling him about the meal plan that he had thought up with Yaoyorozu and asked for Izuku's input. It looks pretty well balanced. How are we going to come up with the teams? Are they going to be permanent or should they be shuffled around every few weeks? The green-haired boy asked deep in thought. He was actually looking forward to trying the team cooking exercise out. We should draw lots and switch the teams out every 3 weeks. We already decided on the first rotation. The class president informed him, pulling forth a sheet of paper with their names on. Izuku noticed that each team had at least 1 girl in it. He was paired up with Azui, Kirishima, and Todoroki. Izuku knew that Azui was used to cooking for others, but he didn't know about the 2 others. He just hoped that they wouldn't set the whole kitchen on fire. Izuku looked up from the paper and let his eyes look over his classmates. The girls were all busy discussing something related to a girls' night the coming weekend, and Izuku accidentally overheard parts of it and wondered if girl really had those stereotypical slumber parties as shown on TV. He would have to ask Uraraka for confirmation on that. She seemed so engrossed in their conversation that he didn't have the heart to interrupt. His eyes lingered on her for a few more seconds before moving on to the rest. Everyone was behaving normally, but Izuku was starting to feel something close to unrest. It felt like he was being watched. Shaking off the feeling, Izuku returned to his meal and started another conversation with Ida and Todoroki, who were seated in front of him. Among the boys, Izuku felt that he was closest to those 2 and then Kaken and Kirishima. Maybe it would be okay to tell them about his and Uraraka's nightmares, but he still hadn't spoken to her about it. Although Izuku was planning on approaching her later, the matter would have to wait a while longer. He still didn't know the extent of Uraraka's nightmares, so he would have to get her to open up to him first. That also meant he had to be honest with her regarding his own problems. Sighing, Izuku tried to put the thoughts away. The rest of the day passed quickly and Izuku later met with All Might in the gym to show his progress. He and All Might had been working on his fine control as well as instant activation of his quirk. He was improving but at a slow rate, at least according to himself. Izuku knew that he was extremely hard on himself, but he would not allow himself to be powerless ever again. All Might seemed to have sensed some of his turmoil from the way he was staring intently at him. "Are you pulling all-nighters again, young 𝗵𝗃𝗍?" the former hero asked with his eyes somewhat squinted. He could see the dark circles underneath Izuku's eyes and was worried he was overworking himself yet again. Results weren't achieved overnight, but with consistency and repetition, it wouldn't do if the boy rushed ahead and got himself hurt. "And no, I just have a little trouble sleeping. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, but I go back to sleep and it's usually fine," Izuku quickly explained, afraid that All Might was seeing through his half-truth. He hated not being honest with All Might of all people, but he simply couldn't admit how affected he was by the recent events. He knew that it would put a stop to his training, and he couldn't afford lagging behind. "Are you sure? Maybe you should get a health checkup to see if there are any lingering side effects or trauma. I'm sure Recovery Girl won't mind." The elderly nurse would more likely be delighted that he came to see her on his own, and honestly speaking, All Might was starting to get a little worried that 𝗵𝗃𝗍 had taken on some sort of oath to become stronger and defend every living person on Earth. Still, he didn't want to pressure the boy into telling him everything on his mind. He was certain that 𝗵𝗃𝗍 would come see him when he was ready. "I'm fine really, but I'll definitely think about it," Izuku promised solemnly. Sighing, All Might stopped his probing and continued the training session. Izuku spent a good hour under All Might's tutelage and returned to the dorm with new exercises to try out, like puncturing an orange interchangeably with his fingers. The rest of the evening passed without anything interesting happening. Izuku finished off whatever cake he had left and got to work on his assignments for the following week, before heading to bed. The next 2 days were spent with Night Eye and his sidekicks and were over in a flash. Izuku had been terribly busy and barely had time to see his friends. Between his daily training and the internship as well as keeping up with his studies, having much of a social life was hard. He had briefly spoken to Kirishima earlier that morning when they were both headed to the train station, and his red-haired classmate had looked as exhausted as Izuku felt. Keeping up with school and everything else is hard, he had complained as he tried to walk and work out the kinks in his neck at the same time. He had looked over at 𝗵𝗃𝗍, who was walking sluggishly beside him. The guy seemed almost dazed while he walked. If he continued like that, he'd probably walk into a lamppost. "I know. I've been finishing homework ahead of time, but it still feels like I need to study harder," Izuku had replied and suppressed a yawn. He had dreamed about All Might being drained of blood so the villains could get their hands on his power, and the dream had left him shaking in its wake. He tried his best to hide the remnants of panic in his voice and body language, but wasn't successful. "𝗵𝗃𝗍𝗍, you all right, man?" Kirishima, bless his heart, asked with obvious worry in his voice. Izuku smiled a little at that. Leave it to Kirishima to be so concerned about others' well-being when he was in just as bad shape. His eyes bore into Izuku's and the green-haired boy felt compelled to answer, so he nodded. The other boy frowned in response. "Yeah, just not sleeping well." Izuku sent him a tired smile and slowed down when he reached the intersection they were supposed to part at. He felt relieved when Kirishima's frown disappeared and was replaced with his usual cheerful look. "Listen, if you need my help, don't hesitate. You can count on me." He pointed a thumb against his chest and sent Izuku a bright smile, which he returned with one of his own. "I know I can." Izuku waved when Kirishima took off in the opposite direction, but a nagging feeling slowly built up in his chest. He had said something along the same lines to Uraraka, so why hadn't he heard anything from her in 2 days? Izuku had been standing in front of the door to Uraraka's room for the past 5 minutes, hands still raised to knock. He had tried both calling and texting her, but she hadn't replied even once. Asking Ida and their other classmates led to him finding out that she had been absent that day due to being at her internship. Izuku faintly recalled her telling him she was going to Ryukyu's office the last time they had spoken. He didn't know what had happened during her day, but he hoped she was all right. Izuku had been worried that her sleep-deprived state would hinder her usual performance and lead to mistakes, but Uraraka was careful with herself. She wouldn't let her fatigue get in the way of her duties. Still, it was unlike the brunette to not answer his texts when she was free. She could, of course, be asleep. Izuku had considered that possibility as well, and if that was the case he would feel horrible for waking her up when she was finally able to rest. For these reasons, the aspiring hero was still standing outside, trying to decide whether or not to knock on the door. In the end, Izuku decided to leave her alone. She might have needed some time for herself since she was keeping her distance or she was taking a nap. With that in mind, Izuku returned to the first floor where he was supposed to meet his group for their first time cooking together. He had been a little nervous at the prospect, but a part of him was also somewhat excited. He generally liked cooking, but he hadn't cooked with anyone other than his mom before. Thinking about his mom brought a smile to Izuku's face. She had been so excited when she heard about Class A's students cooking for each other, and she had greatly encouraged it. She had even offered her assistance if need be. The thought of Inko teaching his classmates the proper way to cut vegetables made him chuckle. "Ah, there he is. Midoriya, hurry." Kirishima's voice cut through to him, and Izuku looked over to see his hot-blooded friend wearing an apron and waving at him from the kitchen area. Behind Kirishima were Azui and Todoroki, both wearing identical aprons to the one on the redhead. The hybrid quirk user was pulling uncomfortably at the fabric, examining it. Azui, on the other hand, looked like it was the most natural thing in the world to be wearing. Izuku could see the fourth apron, which was obviously meant for him, lying on top of the counter, and he walked over and started putting it on. "I'm here. What are we making?" The freckled boy took his place beside Todoroki and looked at the menu. It included rice, fish, steamed vegetables, and egg rolls, among others. Izuku knew how to cook rice and steam vegetables, but didn't have much experience with seafood. "I only know how to make rice." Todoroki spoke up beside him, picking up a large knife and testing his grip. Izuku gently took away the knife, not trusting him to wield anything that sharp. "You don't need a knife to make rice, Todoroki-kun." He sweat-dropped. What kind of rice had he been making before? Suddenly, Izuku feared for everyone's safety. "Midoriya-chan." Azui had been quiet for a few minutes while working on the soup. Izuku, whose concentration had been solely on chopping vegetable, looked up. "Yes? Am I cutting the pieces too large?" Izuku remembered his mother saying something about always cutting food into smaller pieces, so maybe his knife-wielding skills needed work. "No, they're fine. It's about Ochaco-chan." The frog girl glanced at him and returned her attention to stirring the pot with broth. She motioned for Izuku to add the vegetables, which he did while he waited for her to elaborate. Behind them, Kirishima and Todoroki were busy handling the rice and other side dishes, so they weren't paying attention to the conversation between Azui and Izuku. "Is she okay? She hasn't been answering my texts," he finally asked. His mind had wandered back to Uraraka a few more times while he had been with the others, and Izuku hoped she was coming down to eat dinner with everyone else. "Something happened today while we were on patrol. We got split up and Ochaco-chan was ambushed by a villain with a venom quirk. She subdued him, but he managed to poison her. The venom did something to her. She hasn't been herself for the past few days, but after the attack, she completely shut down. They extracted most of the venom and told her to rest for a few days." Azui had lowered her voice so only Izuku could hear her, and she was still looking down into the pot of soup. "Ochaco-chan puts on a brave face all the time and doesn't burden others with her feelings, but for a few days I can tell she's had lots on her mind. I think she is suffering right now." When she met Izuku's eyes, he could see concern for Uraraka as well as an unspoken plea for help. "I know." Izuku steeled himself and made a decision. Azui couldn't help Uraraka by herself, so she was asking him for help, but did she know about the brunette's mental health beforehand? Even if she did, they needed Uraraka to open up and rely on them, otherwise her guilt and anguish would eat her alive. Izuku found himself standing in front of Uraraka's door for the second time that evening. This time, however, he was carrying a tray with several covered dishes and some fruits. He had texted the brunette earlier that he was bringing her dinner, and although she hadn't replied to him, Izuku was certain she had seen his message. "Uraraka-san, I brought you dinner," he called out to her. He didn't expect her to get the door, so he waited for a few moments before announcing he was coming in. It was unlocked. "Uraraka-san? Are you awake?" Izuku asked, slowly stepping into her room. It felt different from the last time he had been there. The air was thick inside and the curtains were drawn so no sunlight, however little was left outside, was making its way in. None of the lamps were on, so Izuku's eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dimness. He carefully stepped forward and placed the tray on top of her table and moved further in until he was standing next to her bed. Uraraka was currently a lump hidden under her blankets. Izuku could tell she was facing the wall from the way her body was curled up. Her breathing was normal, so she probably wasn't asleep. "I'm not hungry." Her voice had been so low that Izuku almost missed it. Luckily, he was standing close enough to her that he heard her speak. "You need to eat something?" Izuku insisted. When she stopped replying, he turned around and sat down on the floor in front of the bed, leaning his back against its frame. He wasn't sure when she had last eaten, and he wasn't leaving until she had emptied the tray. "𝗂𝗧𝗵𝗲 told me what happened. She's very worried about you. So are the others." Izuku's eyes roamed over the few picture frames she had placed on top of her dresser. She also had some succulents next to the frames, and he had to wonder if they were real or not. "Uraraka-san, we are your friends. You are supposed to tell us when you are bothered by something, and it is our job to help you." Izuku leaned his head back a little and looked up at the ceiling. It was hard to have a conversation when he was the only one participating in it. "That I don't want to bother anyone." Her reply was muffled by her blanket, but it reached him nonetheless. "You are too hard on yourself. No one is bothered by you." Izuku chuckled. He came prepared to fight her stubbornness, but he couldn't help but smile at how predictable the situation was. Azui had already warned him that the brunette would insist she was fine, but the frog girl didn't know of Uraraka's promise to him about asking for help. It sounded like Uraraka herself also had forgotten it. "If you don't want to talk about it, will you at least eat something? Please?" He turned his head slightly and waited for her to move or say something. Maybe he would have to force-feed her? But it would become an extraordinary challenge if she made him or the food float. Izuku opted for her to feed herself. The sound of shuffling from behind him told him that she was about to get up. The green-haired teen leaned over and pulled the small table closer so she would have an easier time reaching the food. Uraraka slowly sat up and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. "Did you make this?" Her voice was a little raspy and she seemed a little shaky in her movements. She took a few deep breaths to steady herself before reaching over. "Yes, together with Azui-san, Kirishima-kun and Todoroki-kun." He smiled a little. Uraraka still hadn't looked directly at him. Her hands shook a little and her breathing sounded a little off. "Can you help me down on the floor?" she asked after a moment of silence. Izuku could see how it would be easier to eat when she was sitting down, and he quickly agreed. Grabbing a cushion, he placed it right in front of her and got up to help her. He placed one arm behind her back and the other took her hands as he eased her off the bed and onto the floor. Uraraka's legs wobbled as she tried sitting down and she gripped onto Izuku for dear life. When she finally met his eyes, Izuku felt like punching something at 100%. More specifically, he felt like punching the villain that ambushed her and anyone else that caused her trauma. Her face was as white as a sheet and her eyes looked hollow. He noticed the tiny cuts and bruises that were scattered across her skin, how chapped her lips were, and how she kept closing her eyes in concentration when she moved too much. Maybe she had overused her quirk and was feeling nauseous on top of everything, but he didn't ask. Well, she did get poisoned. Maybe that's causing her nausea. Izuku thought dryly. She was probably drained for energy, and for a moment he considered offering to hold the bowl for her, but when she finally settled down and picked up the soup bowl without spilling any, he changed his mind. Izuku knew how much Uraraka hated feeling weak and wanting to everything by herself, so he didn't want her to think he was taking pity on her. If she asked for his help, he would gladly help her, heck, he would even feed her, but she seemed to be doing fine so far. Ochaco took a few spoonfuls and sighed in content. The soup was warming her up. The feeling of warmth in her body made her realize just how hungry she was. That and also the growl from her stomach that followed the soup. The brunette tentatively bit into the chopped up vegetable and chewed slowly. "It's good," she told him over another spoonful. She finally ventured out into more solid food and took a bite of the egg rolls Kirishima had cooked. They had finely chopped onions, carrots and spring onions in them, so they were fairly standard, but they were still delicious. Kirishima-kun is actually very skilled in the kitchen. He's very creative and also good at preparing ingredients beforehand, Midoriya told her. For some reason, Ochaco believed it. She could just imagine Kirishima being bored and testing out recipes for fun. "What did you make?" she asked as she took a sip of water to wash down the eggs. "Soup with Ajuisan." It was actually her that did most of the cooking, the guys just assisted her. "Oh, and Kirishima-kun and I tried to keep Todoroki-kun out of trouble." The freckled boy laughed. Ochaco wondered what had happened since the best student in their class needed to be kept in check. Tsuyu-chan is used to cooking for her siblings, so it was probably just routine for her. Ochaco had started on the fish and was feeling a little better. She didn't miss the worried glances Midoriya sent her when she struggled with swallowing right away or when she had to breathe deeply before continuing. She was still taking it slow and chewing for longer than was probably necessary, but she didn't want Deku to leave just yet. Not that she thought he would actually leave as soon as she finished eating. No, he was too much of a sweetheart to do that. He would likely stay until she asked him to leave. That was just the type of person he was. Ochaco still felt bad about not answering his text messages. "I'm sorry for not replying earlier." She glanced at him before finishing off the rice, which had an unusual texture to it. It wasn't bad, but it felt a little too stiff and sticky. Done with her meal, Ochaco thanked him for the food and pushed back the tray. "It's okay. I figured you were probably sleeping." He replied gently and smiled a little. His eyes were still filled with worry, but his shoulders weren't as tense as they had been minutes ago. "I tried to. But I kept waking up every few minutes." Ochaco didn't want to admit it, but she had been afraid to fall asleep. The venom hadn't just affected her body, it had done something to her brain too. At least it felt like it. "Nightmare?" He lowered his voice even though they were alone. The brunette was surprised at the hesitation she felt from him before he asked. He was always being so considerate of her and constantly worrying about her. Ochaco felt like she had to be honest with him. "Did Tsuyu-chan tell you about the patrol?" she asked slowly, and when he nodded, she swallowed thickly before continuing. She wasn't sure it was a good idea to tell him, but she couldn't just keep everything to herself. Not when she had promised him to rely on him. "After we got split up, I tracked one of the villains. He shot out poison like Mina does acid. Anyway, I managed to isolate him on a smaller street and I used the moves Gunhead taught me, but he was smart. He managed to graze me with his poison, while I used whatever objects and trash was lying on the street to knock him out." Ochaco shuddered and her hand went up to her upper arm where she had been grazed. The bandage covered her corroded skin and it was hidden under her shirt. "The poison had a few seconds delay before the effect kicked in, but it made my knees buckle. I vomited and broke into cold sweat, I think. It just became hazy. I remember thinking I had to bind him while he was down, but I couldn't move. And then I started hallucinating. It was horrible. I would see blood flooding into the streets. Then you guys would emerge from the blood. You were all trying to kill me. When the others found me, they told me Quirk had gone into overdrive and I made so many objects float that I passed out." Talking so much made Ochaco feel out of breath. She looked at Midoriya and he looked like his jaw was set in stone. His knuckles had turned white from clenching his hands so tightly, and she was worried he would draw blood. "What happened then?" He gritted out through clenched teeth. Ochaco didn't dare lie, but now came the hardest part. She had to swallow the lump that had formed in her throat before she could continue. "They captured him and then they saw my arm. The paramedics that had been called started extracting the poison, but it looked like it had disappeared. They could only find traces of it in my body. The hallucinations hadn't stopped at that point, so I attacked them. Luckily, I didn't hurt anyone, but they had to knock me out with sedatives." Tears had formed in the corners of her eyes as she continued. "I woke up in the hospital with Ryukyu and some doctors next to me. They'd been doing some tests. The poison had more of a drug-like effect, and it made me completely delusional for a while. When I came to, they made me some physical tests to check for damage. And I still can't use my quirk." She hiccuped and the tears started streaming down her face. "You can't use your quirk?" Midoriya breathed in disbelief. Ochaco threw herself at him, sobbing. It took Izuku 3 seconds to react. 1 second to realize what Uraraka had just told him, another to notice her sobbing hysterically, and a third to figure out that he was supposed to console her when she was crying on his shoulder. Slowly, his brain started functioning again and he tentatively put his arms around her and pulled her closer so she wasn't hanging on him. Given their position, she was halfway sitting on his lap with her head buried in his chest as sobs racked through her body. Other than his mom, Izuku had never comforted another crying person before. In the 𝗵𝗃𝗍 household, crying was used to express feelings both good and bad, and he and his mother often cried together. This situation was so different from anything he had experienced before, so the poor boy was at a loss for what he could do to comfort Uraraka. For now, he could only hold her as she cried. Hesitating slightly, Izuku gently rubbed circles on her back to soothe her. He remembered his mother doing the same for him when he was a child, and she would even speak words of comfort in a soothing voice, so naturally, he tried to do the same thing. Ochaco had lost all control of herself and she had to let out all her pent-out frustrations. She felt powerless. She had been robbed of her quirk and she had never felt so vulnerable before. Recalling the events from earlier that day did nothing to calm her down, it just made her cry harder onto Deku's chest. She faintly registered that she was getting tears and snot all over his shirt, but she didn't care about that right now. She wanted to scream until her lungs burst and she wanted to be stronger and not feel so goddamn miserable. She wanted to be able to stand proud and show everyone that she was strong and capable, but it was impossible when she was so weak. How could she become a hero and help others when she couldn't help herself? Her quirk had been taken away from her and she could do nothing. A part of her was missing and she could only cry. She felt so empty, like a shell of herself. So she cried. She cried and cried until there were no more tears left in her. Ochaco didn't know how long she spent crying, she only knew that Deku stayed with her through it all. It could have been an hour or it could have been 10 minutes, she just knew he was there, holding her close and not letting go. Not once did he stop rubbing her back and he didn't stop muttering comforting words either, unless she spoke. All of the horrible thoughts and feelings she had been suppressing came rushing out of her and she poured her heart out to him, telling him about her doubts and fears. She admitted feeling lost and not knowing if she was strong enough to continue. Her heart ached so much from all her negative feelings, but she was finally letting them all out and 𝗵𝗃𝗍 just sat there and listened, his hold on her tightening once in a while. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She hiccuped against his soaked chest. She felt horrible for ruining his shirt, but crying had released so much of her tension and she was finally able to breathe again. Her eyes burned and her face felt wet. "Don't worry. It's not your fault." She didn't know if he meant soaking his shirt in her bodily fluids or the whole mess they were in. It didn't matter anyway, Ochaco just wanted to hear those words. That it wasn't her fault and that it was okay to be afraid. "I was so scared," she whispered hoarsely. Fear had been one of the feelings she had been overwhelmed by ever since waking up at the hospital. When she woke up among the beeping machines and nurses bustling around her, a terrible fear gripped at her heart and she instantly knew that something was wrong. "Yeah." 𝗵𝗃𝗍 breathed next to her ear and made her lift her head. She looked up at him somewhat fearfully. His hand came to a rest on her back, but his eyes were alert. "Deku-kun, what if I've lost my quirk?" Ochaco stammered, letting fear engulf her once more. The question had burned in the back of her mind for hours, but she had refused to acknowledge it. Now, she couldn't stop herself. "I'm sure it will return eventually, Uraraka-san. You'll just have to believe in your own power." Izuku reasoned and brought a hand up to wipe away some stray tears. She whimpered a little and hid her face in his chest once more, which left Izuku to stroke the top of her head. They stayed like that for a few more minutes before Ochaco finally calmed down. She decided that she would let herself indulge in this moment of selfishness before picking herself back up. After all, she couldn't do it by herself. "They told me to report to Ryukyu and the doctors tomorrow morning." She finally pulled back and looked up at him. She was sure her face was messed up, but she also knew it didn't matter to Izuku. He still kept one of his arms loosely around her, now that she was sitting next to him. "I'll go with you if you want," the freckled boy offered. He felt her take some deep breaths and nod once. Ochaco swiped at her eyes with her sleeve and sighed loudly. "Man, I feel so much better after getting all that out," she claimed and leaned her head on Izuku's shoulder. The boy seemed lost in thought for a moment, but then leaned his head ever so lightly down, so their heads were touching. Ochaco was still feeling woozy, so she closed her eyes to stop her head from spinning. She inhaled deeply and let it all out again a couple of times, before addressing him again. "Thank you for listening," she whispered and nudged him lightly with her shoulder, which caused their heads to knock together slightly. Izuku just smiled at the gesture of affection. "Thank you for telling me," he replied softly and nuzzled her head with his own. He was happy he had helped her let out her feelings and that she had leaned on him as support. Leaned on him. It was only then he realized how close they were sitting and how much of their bodies were touching each other, and he stopped breathing. Uraraka was pressed flush against his side. Her leg was aligned with his, their arms were pressed together, and her head was resting on his shoulder. "I'll also have to tell Tsuyu-chan that I'm fine." Ochaco suppressed a yawn and lifted her head from his shoulder to look for her cell phone. She got up from the floor, still a little shaky, and grabbed the phone, quickly texting her friend. She didn't notice her friend had frozen beside her. Izuku was finally able to breathe again and frantically tried to calm himself and stop his face from turning red. It was a lost cause and he knew it. Uraraka had sat back down on her bed and this time a yawn escaped her. Who knew crying could be so tiring? She asked sheepishly, but it gave Izuku the perfect opportunity to make his escape. He quickly got up from the floor and started putting the now empty bowls back onto the tray. Uraraka looked at him with curiosity as he retreated back towards the door. "Alright, you must be tired after the day you've had. I'll be going now. Good night." He fumbled with the doorknob but was eventually able to open the door, his face burning up. "Good night." He faintly heard Uraraka call after him as he slammed the door shut and made a beeline for the elevator. Once inside, Izuku spent a good 5 minutes just breathing and getting his heart rate down, before he pressed the button for the first floor. He had hugged a girl, and she had cried on his shoulder. That was normal, right? For friends to comfort each other? It wasn't like they had done anything wrong, so why was his heart beating so fast? Was he even a virgin anymore? Midoriya. Kirishima startled him out of his thoughts and Izuku nearly dropped the tray in his hands. "What? We didn't do anything. We're just friends, I swear." Izuku panicked and blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. He hadn't even noticed when he had reached the kitchen, having been on autopilot the entire way down. Kirishima just looked at him, puzzled. "How is Uraraka? Did she eat?" The redhead asked and helped Izuku load the dirty dish into the dishwasher. Living in a dorm full of teenagers had made Izuku appreciate the technological wonder, and he had found himself respecting his mother even more for always handling chores by herself. "Yeah. She really liked it and said thank you. She's resting now," Izuku explained as they cleared out from the kitchen. Kirishima had been the only one in the kitchen, but a few of the others were still hanging around the lounge area. They had stopped walking halfway to the sofas, where the rest were hanging out. "That's good. After you left, Tsuyu-chan told us that she had been injured earlier. She looked really worried," Kirishima told him. He rarely saw the frog-like girl display so many emotions. She was usually so calm and collected, especially in moments of crisis. "She'll be fine," Izuku tried to convince him. He was pretty sure Azui hadn't told him the extent of the injuries, but he was glad to see that Kirishima still cared. "I hope she gets better soon. Otherwise, she might end up having to take supplementary lessons with the rest of us." Izuku knew Kirishima said it out of concern for her, but it still shocked him that he was so blunt. Had Uraraka's grades been slipping these past couple of weeks? She hadn't mentioned anything, but maybe she had forgotten or was just embarrassed. Or maybe she had too much on her plate to concentrate on her grades. "I saw the results on her quiz by accident and it was a lot lower than normal," the redhead elaborated. He must have seen the confused look on Izuku's face. He crossed his arms behind his head and sighed. "I see. I think she'll manage somehow." Izuku put a hand to his chin as he thought it over. He had noticed that Uraraka had seemed unfocused in class, but he didn't know that her grades had suffered from it. He'd ask tomorrow when they went to her checkup. "Out of the way, Deku." Kaken's gruff voice sounded behind him and Izuku moved out of habit. He hadn't noticed the blonde approaching, but he was too busy thinking about Uraraka's situation to give it more thought. He didn't even notice the odd look he received from Kaken as he passed him. Kirishima raised an eyebrow as Midoriya wordlessly moved away from Bakugo. Usually he would at least try to interact with the angry teenager, but lately it had seemed like the freckled teen had a lot on his mind. Ijiro wasn't much for prying, but sometimes this hopeless look came over Midoriya like he was desperately trying to forget something that still haunted him. The redhead had tried to reach out to him before, but since Midoriya hadn't asked for his help, he guessed that the other boy was holding up fine. Ijiro might have been slow on the uptake, but he was by no means stupid. He knew that Midoriya and Uraraka were displaying signs of, well, not necessarily PTSD, but something along those lines. No one had opened up and talked about it, but he could see the cracks in the masks his classmates wore. What he didn't understand was why no one wanted to talk about it or get help. They had been through hell. They didn't have their childish innocence any longer. They couldn't pretend that everything was fine. Maybe they should inform Aizawa-sensei? He didn't get to discuss it with Midoriya, since the green-haired teen muttered something about studying and going to bed soon. Kirishima stared after him long after he disappeared. Midoriya was probably the best candidate to help everyone else in their class. The boy possessed a certain conviction and he had easily earned everyone's trust during these past few months. All in all, he was pretty reliable and his observational skills were extraordinary, so there was no way he hadn't noticed the signs of stress and wasn't thinking up some sort of solution. The redhead decided to give it a few more days. He wouldn't get anything out of rushing him. He just hoped it was the right thing to do. The next morning Izuku had woken up when he received a text from Uraraka saying her quirk had returned. She had been ecstatic and so relieved when they met in front of the dorm. Her eyes had still been puffy and she had once again apologized for ruining his shirt. "Did you sleep all right?" Izuku had asked her after they had walked for a while. She had nodded and told him that she only woke up once that night. "And I drank lots of water so I didn't get dehydrated," she told him as cheerfully as she could. He would have believed that she was back to her usual self had it not been for the dark circles under her eyes as well as all the cuts and bruises. She also couldn't walk at her usual fast pace, which was another thing to consider. Her health had improved by a bit and she had eaten breakfast and wasn't nauseous any longer. They took the train to the station nearest the hospital where Uraraka had been sent the previous day. Once they were inside, Uraraka was ushered away by the nurses and Izuku shown to the waiting area where he sat down in the most comfortable chair he could spot. The spot he chose was pretty much empty, so Izuku could think without disturbing others. He had spent a good part of the night tossing and turning while replaying his conversation with Uraraka. After coming to terms with the fact that he had instinctively hugged her when she needed comfort, he had thought about all the things she had told him. She had been suffering quietly for so long, and he was just happy she had opened up about her feelings. Still, it had been so hard to listen to her desperate cries when she thought her quirk was lost for good. He had so badly wanted to tell her that he knew how it felt and tell her about his past, but he had to grit his teeth and focus on the girl in his arms. What she had needed was reassurance that she was going to be okay. She didn't need to make her feel worse by telling about his own misery. He would eventually tell her more about his childhood, but for now, he stuck with the same explanation everyone else had gotten. That his quirk manifested extremely late and therefore was hard to control for him. Izuku longed for the day he could be honest about everything, but he also knew it would jeopardize every relationship he had, and he would never allow that. Izuku had been sitting for close to an hour when Uraraka returned followed by a nurse and Ryukyu. She bid them farewell before walking over to where he was sitting. She looked a little better than when they had arrived. Some of the color had returned to her cheeks and she was walking more steadily. Izuku figured one of the nurses had a quirk similar to Recovery Girl and had used it on her. "Are you ready to go back?" he asked as they gathered their belongings and got ready to head out. Uraraka nodded and hoisted her bag up on her shoulder. They had notified their teachers about the checkup and had gotten the morning periods off. They still needed to make it back for afternoon classes. On the way back to the school, she filled him in on what he could. Since Ryukyu had been present, Izuku expected it to be something related to her work. "All traces of the poison are gone, and they were happy my quirk was back to normal." The brunette started off, trying to recall everything she had been told the past hour. Some of the information was classified and she had to take a moment to sort through what she could tell Deku and what she couldn't. Did they figure out what the poison was? since it blocked or erased your quirk? Izuku asked, already thinking of 100 possibilities on his own. It worked like a drug and blocked some receptors in the brain, so I couldn't activate my quirk. It was a lot like a drug they are dealing with in the city. She repeated what she had been told earlier, although it didn't make that much sense to her. Oh okay, so it could be a quirk that worked like a repressor in the body, but that would mean it was very specific in its targeting. What if it affected other parts of the body that hadn't been checked? Could this quirk have been used to manufacture such drugs? Could an antidote be formulated if the poison's every property was known? Maybe Yaoyorozu-san would be able to create an antidote if she got a look at it. Izuku's mutter storms always amused Uraraka, but she also greatly admired the way he instantly started thinking of solutions. Maybe. They're looking into it and told me to alert them ASAP if I felt any discomfort. Ochaco felt like a heavy burden had been removed from her shoulders. She was happy there hadn't been any side effects so far, and she was grateful she hadn't gone alone. Thanks again for coming with me. She smiled and took his hand while she leaned a little into him. She felt him freeze when she squeezed his hand and it immediately started sweating. He was so cute to get flustered over small touches like this. Why, you're welcome. He stammered and looked away as his face flushed. Feeling like she had tortured him for long enough, Ochaco let go of his hand and continued walking. She had gotten an idea and she was going to have fun with this discovery. More often than not, Ida was used to being the voice of reason and he liked to approach any situation rationally. His deductions and theories were based on logic and he weighed pros and cons before making a decision. This was why he had proposed that Class 1A start small study groups to keep up with their grades and continuously challenge one another. Pros: the students in question could get tutoring suited to their level and improve their academic achievements, while the ones tutoring could shoulder the responsibility of teaching another person. The cons: it would take a lot of patience from both sides to successfully implement peer-based tutoring, but the class president was convinced it would work out in everyone's favor. The idea had come to him following a conversation with Azui and Uraraka, who had been discussing strategies on how to balance homework with internships, and Ida had remembered that a handful of students had been letting their grades slip. The next time they had a class meeting, he had suggested the tutoring, and with the support of the vice president along with Aizawa-sensei, Ida had set his plan into motion. Although Ida wanted to help his classmates perform better in school, he had noticed a few things over the past couple of weeks. What stood out the most to him was how many of the students looked sleep-deprived and withdrawn even. It was one of the reasons he suspected that grades were slipping, which could be blamed on lack of discipline or a good work ethic, but seeing as he also cared for his classmates and their well-being, he had come to conclude that they were affected by other things. So the tutoring proposition served another purpose, which was to bring the students closer and hopefully help each other to deal with their respective problems. Ida might not be the most discreet person of the bunch, but he was acutely aware of how the villain attacks and Bakugo's kidnapping had affected the students in their class and was hoping that being forced together in smaller groups would help them ease their worries and unburden their hearts. True heroes always save the heart of others. The class president was confident that it would somehow work out. He just had to believe in the qualities of his classmates and friends. That being said, there was still something he had to find out about said friends. Midoriya, he called out to his freckled friend when he noticed the smaller boy leaving the classroom. Their last class for the day had ended and the students were either headed back to the dorm or loitering around. Yes? Izuku stopped mid-step and looked over his shoulder to see Ida hurrying after him and waited for the class president to catch up. Are you headed back? Let's go together, Ida suggested and started leading the way. The two of them had walked to the station together so many times when they lived at home, and Tenya couldn't see why that should stop now when they were sharing living spaces. Sure. Izuku fell into step with the taller boy, matching his fast pace. There had been something different about Ida the whole day, but Izuku couldn't quite place his finger on what it was. Ida was always serious and could often get intense, but there was something different about his intensity today. Midoriya, you are always quick to notice things with your keen observational skills and analytical mind, Ida stated out of the blue, causing Izuku to scrunch his brows together in confusion. The dark-haired boy looked at him sideways, gauging his reaction. Oh, I guess so? It was true. Izuku had been an awkward boy and had always watched other people in any type of situation he could. It was like second nature to him now. I'm sure you've noticed that something seems amiss with a few of our classmates. He waited for Izuku to nod his confirmation, before continuing his verbal dissertation, all the while keeping a steady pace. The freckled boy was starting to see where Ida was going with his observation, and he wasn't liking it. They seem less spirited and grades are slipping. From what I can tell, some of our classmates are behaving unusually and are showing signs of distress, particularly Uraraka and yourself. Ida looked pointedly at Izuku, shocking him a little. Had he really noticed? Me? But I am fine really. Izuku was sure he hadn't let his facade slip for days on end, so how had Ida seen right through him? He could feel a bead of sweat roll down his temple and racked his brain for an explanation. Ida adjusted his glasses that had slipped down his nose and slowly came to a halt. There was no one else nearby, so he felt confident about confronting his friend here with no one to listen in on their conversation. Please don't lie to me, Midoriya. I know from the bags under your eyes that you aren't sleeping and you've been skipping meals again. Not many, but enough to tell me that you don't have much of an appetite. The bespectacled boy was staring intently at Izuku, almost making him squirm under his gaze. Well, Izuku sighed and finally nodded in defeat. There was no use lying to Ida and pretending he was fine, when he had already been found out. Better make it as painless as possible. You're right. I've been having nightmares almost every night since the training camp, Izuku slowly admitted. Ida's gaze softened and he waited patiently for Izuku to continue. Taking a deep breath, the green-haired teen decided to confide in his friend instead of carrying the burden by himself. About Bakugo's kidnapping or the attacks in general? Ida asked and prompted Midoriya to continue. He could see his friend struggle to continue their conversation from the way he bit down on his lip. It took a few seconds before Midoriya looked up at him again with determined eyes. Tenya felt relieved that he didn't have to force it out of him and steeled himself for what was to come. In my dreams, the people I care for are constantly being hurt. My mom, Uraraka and you, the rest of our class and even our teachers, you are all being hurt and I'm powerless. I can't help anyone. I'm always forced to watch while my friends get tortured and I can't move, I can't breathe, I can't think, I can only watch. Izuku could feel tears beginning to form at the corner of his eyes and slowly his vision became blurry. He faintly registered Ida putting a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he couldn't stop himself from continuing. All the horrible visions he had been keeping locked up inside him were spilling out, and his heart felt like it was going to burst any second now. There's always so much blood and you are all screaming for help, screaming for the pain to stop and I just can't save anyone. And the villains just laugh and break bones like it's a sport. They cut open my mom and show me her heart beating slower and slower until they squash it like a fruit. And all M and everyone else are being hurt just as badly. You're being drained for blood and they cut you open with knives and sharp instruments, and I am so weak. He choked on the last word and noticed Ida frantically trying to say something, but he couldn't hear anything other than his heart pounding in his ears. His knees felt weak and were threatening to buckle under him, and he felt bile rise in his throat. He couldn't breathe and the tears were falling freely from his eyes, blinding him momentarily. As he spoke, he had felt his heartbeat increasing and he knew that he was talking a mile a minute and probably not making much sense, but that didn't matter to him. He had wanted to get everything off his chest and tell someone about his terrible dreams, and when he finally did, he was falling into pieces. Ida was saying something to him, but it sounded warped to his ears. Then another, much clearer voice sounded right next to him and Izuku focused on the extra hand on his back. Just breathe, buddy, it'll be okay. Izuku recognized the voice and tried his best to get his breathing under control. Ida was holding on to him, making sure he stayed upright, also speaking words of comfort, but the second voice was the one he focused on. You'll be fine, Midoriya, just breathe. And out. Slowly. It'll be over soon, just keep on breathing. The voice was low and soothing to Izuku, so he did as he was asked and breathed. He finally got to the point where his legs weren't shaking anymore and he was able to stand without support from his taller friend. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Kirishima standing with a small smile and felt him rub his back again. Izuku wanted to thank him, but it came out as him wheezing instead. Just focus on breathing, Midoriya. You're almost there. Kirishima moved around Izuku and stood next to Ida, both boys still holding him up. The redhead exchanged glances with Ida and nodded his head when the class president made to release Midoriya. Kirishima wasted no time and put his arm around the distressed boy to better support him. Ida was frowning in concern. He had no idea that talking about his nightmares would make Midoriya react so badly, and he immediately felt guilty for pushing the issue. He was extremely grateful that Kirishima had appeared and was taking charge of the situation. Frankly, he was a lot better at handling Midoriya in his panicked state than Tenya had been. He watched as Midoriya slowly calmed down and began thanking Kirishima for the support. He looked a little better now. The pain that had crossed his expression was all but gone, and Ida had to wonder how long Midoriya had been bottling all his feelings up. He was pretty sure he hadn't told his mother, but that would have to change. That looked an awful lot like a panic attack. Midoriya? You okay? Kirishima asked and gave his friend a once-over. He seemed fine, but Ijiro kept his arm around him just in case. He nodded weakly in return and tried to straighten up. Kirishima-kun, how did you know what to do? Izuku had only had a panic attack once when he was still in middle school, but this had felt different, so he hadn't recognized the symptoms. Now that he thought about it, he felt a little stupid for thinking it was normal to be feeling such a tremendous amount of fear. Takes one to know one, eh? He smiled somewhat ruefully and didn't elaborate, so the other two let it go. I'm glad you showed up, Kirishima-kun. You handled the situation well. Ida exclaimed, having regained his composure. He would have to talk to Midoriya later, but he was actually considering involving Kirishima. Maybe he could arrange for them to be in the same study group? Yeah, thank you. Midoriya smiled weakly at him. The haunted look he had been walking around with almost disappeared, but having been around the aspiring hero for so long made Ijiro able to see the traces of stress still on his face. No problem, guys. Now, let's get you back to your room. You gotta be tired. During super move training the next day, Izuku had noticed that his control over One for All had gotten slightly better after he had increased his weight training. Being physically stronger meant that he was better suited to wield the immense power in him, and while he worked on being able to control it with pinpoint precision, he was overjoyed that he could grasp the power a little better. All Might had also praised him for putting in the extra effort and polishing his skills. Izuku had gotten to the point where he could maintain full cowl for 15 minutes straight. During training and sparring with his classmates, however, he had trouble focusing on distributing the power evenly. His bones weren't snapping any longer, but throwing an uncontrolled punch stung and his limbs ached for days. Izuku was currently lifting weights and trying his best not to puke from the heavy load. He had upped the weight load again, only by a kilo this time, but he was still breathing heavily after finishing his set. You are improving fast, young Midoriya, but be careful not to rush. You will get there in time, I promise. All Might put a hand on his shoulder with the corner of his mouth quirked up. Even in his weaker form, it was easy to see the pride he felt when he looked at his successor. Thank you, All Might. Izuku wiped the sweat off his brow and stood up straight. He reached for his water bottle and noticed that Uraraka and Ida were throwing him worried glances every now and then. They were both working on their own moves, but he would periodically feel their eyes on them. Is something the matter? All Might asked and craned his neck to see what had caught the young boy's attention. It's nothing, Izuku hurriedly said. He had already worried his friends with his problems. He didn't need All Might to get involved as well. The former hero had enough on his plate as it was. Izuku didn't want to add to his worries. Your friends are worried about you, All Might observed, making Izuku freeze beside him. For a second, he feared that All Might already knew about his bad dreams, but he forced himself to relax his shoulders and get himself under control. Did you perhaps hurt yourself again? But you've been better at controlling your strength, so maybe there is something else? Did you fail a test? No matter, you should still go and reassure them that you are fine. Unless you aren't? All Might's gaze rested on Izuku and he felt like a deer caught in headlights. He hated lying to All Might, but he was honestly feeling better than he had in days. And no, everything is fine. The teenager insisted, waving his hands around frantically. All Might's eyes bore into his, And Izuku was just a second away from spilling the beans when Uraraka came to his rescue, breaking the spell All Might had cast over him. "Are you done for the day, Deku-kun?" Her voice was soft, but there was a hopeful tone to her words. She was red-faced and panting slightly, water bottle clutched in her hand. "Go ahead." All Might smiled at the two teenagers and made his exit. Now that he knew Midoriya was hiding something, it was only a matter of time before the freckled boy would come clean and admit it. Midoriya seemed to be in good hands, so the pro-hero took his cue to exit. "Thanks, Uraraka-san. You saved me there." Izuku sighed in relief as soon as his mentor was out of earshot. He bent down to pick up his water bottle and turned around to find Uraraka looking at him with curiosity. "You looked uncomfortable. You haven't told All Might or Aizawa-sensei?" The gravity girl asked, looking around to make sure the teachers in question weren't nearby. "No." Midoriya scratched his head and looked away awkwardly. Ochaco wasn't one to talk though. She had only told Deku and not her parents, so it was a case of the pot calling the kettle black. Midoriya was still looking away, so she decided to change the topic. "More importantly, Kirishima-kun told me you had a panic attack yesterday. Are you all right now?" Ochaco had been worried out of her mind when she had heard from Kirishima that morning as they headed downstairs at the same time, but she hadn't been able to catch Deku alone during the day and ask him. She could have texted him and asked, but she preferred to talk in person. "Yeah, luckily both Ida-kun and Kirishima-kun were there to help me. But I'm fine now." He looked at her with a small smile, remembering how the two had stayed with him for over an hour before they believed he was fine. He had been happy that his friends cared so much about him and couldn't stop smiling. "I'm glad," she replied with a smile of her own and started heading towards the exit, Izuku right beside her. "What about you? Have you had any trouble after the checkup?" It had only been 2 days, but the brunette was feeling like she usually did. "Only trouble sleeping." Ochaco tapped a finger on her chin, thinking. She hadn't been nauseous again and she was pretty much back on her feet. She had even been able to participate in the super move training without any problems, so she assumed she was fine. Her quirk was back to normal as well. "I see." They walked in silence for a few minutes, both lost in thought, but occasionally brushing against each other. Izuku managed to keep his cool when their arms touched, but he was still incredibly self-conscious about their close proximity. The dorm was only 5 more minutes away when Ochaco remembered why she had wanted to see him. "Oh, that's right. I have a favor to ask of you." The brunette stopped walking and looked at him with pleading eyes. Izuku didn't know what she was going to ask, but he was already doomed. He couldn't refuse her when she looked at him like that and made his face flush. "What is it?" His voice a tad more high-pitched than he would have liked, but Uraraka didn't seem to notice it. She stopped staring at him and grabbed a strand of her hair to twirl between her fingers. She was a little embarrassed to be asking, but he was her only hope. "Could you maybe tutor me until the end of term?" She blurted out and hid her face in her hands. She was too embarrassed to look at his face, but willed herself to calm down and face him. "Come again?" Izuku wasn't sure he had heard her correctly, but it had sounded like she was asking him to tutor her. "You know the tutoring Ida-kun suggested? I was hoping you would tutor me. Ida-kun already offered to help me, but I feel like I wouldn't be able to meet his expectations if he took the time to teach me. That and I feel like I understand things better when you are the one teaching me." Uraraka explained and removed her hands from her face, focusing instead on kicking pebbles on the ground. "I don't think Ida-kun would think badly of you if he was in charge of tutoring you, but I don't mind helping you." Izuku consented, already imagining Ida blaming himself for not being a better tutor. "Really? You're the best, Dad." Uraraka brightened and threw her arms around his waist, making him squeak from surprise. He still wasn't used to being hugged, so he had no idea how to react, and before he knew it, Uraraka had let go of him and started walking again. He didn't regret agreeing, but if she kept hugging him like that, he wasn't sure his heart would be able to take it. "So if you apply this formula here, you are 1 step away from solving the whole equation." Izuku pointed to a formula on the page that he had marked with a box around it. His pencil tapped lightly against the paper while he waited for his companion to finish writing it down. "Oh, I see now." Uraraka's eyes lit up with understanding. They had been working on their math homework for nearly an hour and they were finally getting close to finishing. Tomorrow, they were going to review English, which was one of Ochaco's weaker subjects and the part she dreaded the most. After finishing up their homework for the day, Ochaco sank back on the chair and exhaled loudly. Working with Deku had been rewarding to say at least. He was patient, spoke kindly, and practically glowed when she solved problems correctly. His encouraging smiles had also been an added bonus, and Ochaco found that she didn't mind one bit when his smiles were directed towards her. "I'm surprised we finished so quickly," 𝗵𝗃𝗍 said as he closed his notebooks and put them back in his bag. They were sitting at one of the tables in the common room and it was getting close to dinner time, so it felt great to be done ahead of time. They hadn't been the only ones who were studying on the first floor and their classmates were steadily showing up. Iida had offered to help them study, but he was on cooking duty that day, so they had decided to study with him the following day instead. Todoroki had also joined them for a while, but he finished early and returned to his room, wanting to take a nap before dinner. Ochaco found that she didn't mind Todoroki studying with them. He was good at challenging 𝗵𝗃𝗍 and the two often ended up in deep discussion. Another thing she had noticed was how relaxed Deku was around the hybrid quirk user, and she was glad their friendship had grown as much as it had. She was aware that 𝗵𝗃𝗍 didn't have many friends, but he seemed to be content with her and Todoroki. Of course there were also Iida and Tsuchan as well as Kirishima, Kaminari and, grudgingly she admitted, Bakugo. She just couldn't wrap her head around why such a sweet and kind person didn't have hordes of people swarming him. At some point, she decided she was going to ask him, but right now, Ochaco just wanted to go back to her room and relax. "It feels like we've been sitting here forever," she exclaimed, which earned a chuckle from her dorky friend. He had been so pleasant to study with and the brunette wondered why she hadn't asked him ages ago. They were slowly getting ready to head back upstairs when Izuku called for her to see something on his phone. Ochaco found herself staring at Izuku's mother and a tiny kitten asleep in her arms. "I can't believe your mom got a kitty. It's so cute." Ochaco squealed with delight when Deku showed her the most recent picture his mom had sent him. Inko had been lonely without her baby boy around, so she had finally decided to get a pet, something she had wanted when she was younger. "Her name is Coco." Izuku knew his mom had always wanted to own a cat, and he was glad she finally made the decision to get one. Coco was a right sweetheart and had not stopped purring once when she was finally introduced to Izuku the previous weekend. Izuku had adored her. "Can I meet her? I love cats." Uraraka beamed up at him and made his knees weak. She was standing so close to him that Izuku thought he was going to pass out. He could move his hand a little and it would be close enough to grab hers, but he kept it firmly planted on his side. "I will ask my mom, but I'm sure it's fine." The poor boy couldn't keep the pitch in his voice out and blurted out his sentence. She was about to say something when a loud noise startled her. Izuku saw her eyes widen in fear and her body freeze before she shrieked. He reacted instantly and grabbed her shoulders, pulling her against him and steadying her. Her shoulders were shaking slightly and she kept her eyes down. He felt her suck in a breath as he called her name. She looked up at him with terrified eyes and his stomach sank. She had been doing so well with her stress and the side effects from the villain attacks, and it broke his heart to see her that scared. "Uraraka." The chorus of loud, feminine voices that had startled her sounded again, and the two of them stepped away from each other. Izuku kept his eyes glued on his friend as she was approached by the other girls. Uraraka had regained her composure and took a deep breath before the girls reached her. "Uraraka, are you finished studying?" Mina appeared behind them with Hagakure in tow. The two girls had been studying with Yaoyorozu and looked about ready to collapse. They were followed by Jiro, who was toying with her jacks, lazily watching the interaction. "Yes?" Ochaco glanced at Izuku, who nodded his head and collected his things so he could leave them to their girl talk. He could faintly hear the excited whisper of Ishido and hoped Uraraka would be fine. In that moment where their eyes had met, he had seen relief as well as a little bit of darkness in her eyes. Izuku had interpreted the look she gave him as a sign that she was okay on her own, but the dimming light in her eyes made him worry. He had a feeling she was in for a rough night. He had been right. He hadn't heard from Uraraka the rest of the evening and had spent time with Iida and some of the other boys. Even Kaken had been present, but the blonde hadn't picked on Izuku once. While he was hanging out with the guys, his eyes kept wandering towards the kitchen where he could see the backs of all the girls, who were currently baking something. His eyes had sought out the brunette in the group and he tried his best to stay seated and not run over to her. Her movements were stiff and he could see that she wasn't as animated as she usually was. Izuku relaxed a little when he saw 𝗬𝗓𝗍 approach her and put a hand on her back. He felt a little better knowing that 𝗬𝗓𝗍 was there to keep an eye on her, and Izuku decided to call it a night. He had been asleep for a couple of hours when he was woken by his cell phone vibrating on his headboard shelf. His hands searched for the phone and he twisted to the side to look for it. The display was still glowing after receiving a text message, so he managed to grab it before the screen turned black. Unlocking the screen, he was glad he hadn't put his phone on silent. "Are you up?" Uraraka's message read. "Yeah. Are you okay?" The glare from the screen had been blinding at first, but now that Izuku's eyes had adjusted to the brightness, he could focus on other things. Like the worry gnawing away at him. "Can you come downstairs?" Izuku was already out of bed looking for his slippers, before he texted her back, saying he'd be there in a minute. Once he reached the first floor, he saw Uraraka sitting in the same sofa he'd found her in almost 2 weeks ago. The scene looked too familiar for his liking, with Uraraka curled up in the sofa and hugging her knees to her chest. She looked up briefly when he stepped closer, but didn't say anything when he sat down next to her, and they sat like that for more than 5 minutes. Izuku leaned back a little and rested his head on the back of the sofa. He could still feel sleep clinging to him, but he willed himself to stay awake in case Uraraka needed him. He looked at her out of the corner of his eyes and saw that she wasn't as tense as before. Izuku secretly hoped that his presence had been the comfort she sought, but he mentally slapped himself. Now was not the time for selfish desires. He should try to get her to speak about the nightmare that was bound to have woken her. If she had slept at all, that is. "Uraraka-san?" She flinched a little when he spoke, having been lost in thought, but looked over at him nonetheless. Ochaco saw him sitting next to her, his hair a mess, his eyes sleepy, but filled with so much worry that she regretted asking him to come down. She didn't want to make him worry like that. Tears welled up in her eyes as the images from her terrible dream flashed before her. Deku had been battered and bruised, but had gone to the end of the world to save her, much like he was doing right now. She couldn't stand seeing him so worried because of her, she just wanted him to smile like he always did. And he was the one who kept getting hurt in her dreams, and she absolutely hated it. He was always saving her even when he was hurt himself. She just didn't want him to worry so much about her. "I can't help worrying about you. You are important to me." His voice was soft and he reached over to brush away the tears on her cheeks, but how did he know that his constant worry had been on her mind? It took Ochaco a second to realize that she had said everything out loud without knowing it. Oh God, how could she be so stupid? Ochaco hid her face in her hands, she was so embarrassed. The tears were smeared all over her face and her eyes stung, but she couldn't bring herself to break apart what little protection her hands offered. "Please don't be embarrassed, Uraraka-san." Ochaco felt him shift closer to her and she fought the urge to jump up and run out of the dorm. "This is the first time you've actually asked for help and told me about your nightmares. I don't want you to feel that it is embarrassing to talk about, when it makes me happy that you trust me enough to confide in me." Ochaco felt his light touch on the back of her hand and he gently pried her hands away from her face. She let him. Her hands landed on her lap and grabbed the fabric of her shorts. Ochaco sneaked a glance at him, and even in the darkness of the lounge, his green eyes shone. He was closer to her than he had been the first time they sat like this, but it wasn't his close proximity that surprised her most. It was his outstretched hand waiting for hers. For a moment, Ochaco didn't know what to do. This was the first time he initiated the contact and she felt herself feeling fuzzy, but the feeling disappeared again. When she slowly reached out and placed her palm in his bigger one, the fuzzy feeling returned. His skin was rough from all the training and the scars from his battles, but it was warm and Ochaco wanted the warmth to stay with her forever. His grip tightened on her hand for a second, and for the second time that night, Ochaco felt herself taken aback by his actions. He was slowly and awkwardly putting his free arm around her shoulders and drawing her closer to his side. They had hugged a few times before, but she had always been the one to initiate. She knew how hard it was for Deku to handle casual touches, much less initiate them, but she was baffled that he was putting an arm around her of his own accord. She could feel the hand she was holding shaking the tiniest bit, but when Deku's arm came to rest and he found a comfortable position to be in, his hand relaxed. She couldn't help but look up at him. His cheeks were probably flushed, but she couldn't tell from the darkness in the room. She had expected him to be embarrassed and look away, but he was looking right back at her, never breaking eye contact. Ochaco felt like he was looking right into her soul. Was it because Ishido-san startled you? His voice was calm, and Ochaco felt his ribs rumble when he spoke. She nodded her head and shifted on the sofa, so she was more comfortable, which of course meant that she was pressed against Midoriya while he was holding her. I don't like people sneaking up on me. Not after. Anyways, she apologized later for surprising me. Ochaco sighed deeply. She had been tense and jumpy ever since it happened, and she was finally able to put it behind her. It was funny how easily Deku took away her unease and hurt, without even doing anything. He was just there. He always was, she realized. I understand. Ochaco was too tired to carry on the conversation and resigned herself to putting her head on his shoulder. Deku stiffened for a second, but relaxed soon after and started rubbing tiny circles on the back of her hand. His shoulder was a comfortable place to rest on, and Ochaco soaked in the warmth that radiated off him. She had nearly fallen back asleep when he spoke again. My mom said that we could drop by tomorrow after classes. Ochaco made an agreeing sound and returned to dozing off on Midoriya's shoulder. Uraraka-san? Izuku tried to catch a glimpse of her face, but her hair had fallen in front of it and she had gone silent and was starting to breathe deeply. She had fallen asleep on his shoulder. Izuku's cheeks flushed as he let go of her hand and seated himself better, so she was leaning back a little more. He couldn't stop the impulse to brush her hair back and tenderly placed it behind her ear. His hand rested on the side of her face for a moment, before he retracted his hand and breathed deeply to get his blushing face under control. Uraraka had been asleep for close to an hour and Izuku's left arm had gone numb. He checked his phone every few minutes with his right hand, hoping that enough time would have passed so he could wake her up without feeling too guilty. The green-haired teen tried flexing his fingers on his left arm, but all he felt was needles prickling him all the way up to the shoulder. Every once in a while, she would frown or let out a small sound, but other than that Uraraka was fast asleep. Izuku felt like a horrible human being for enjoying the way her body was leaning on him and the feel of her weight pressed to his side. Her head was still on his shoulder, but it slipped down a few centimeters after a while. He hoped she wouldn't wake up with a crick in her neck. Izuku frowned and considered carrying Uraraka to her room, but he wasn't comfortable with just grabbing her and bringing her upstairs. For one, it would be inappropriate of him since she was asleep and couldn't consent to letting him carry her. Aside from his moral issues, there was also the possibility that the brunette had left her room locked and he didn't know where she kept her keys. He would die before he searched her pockets and decided to just give her some more time to rest before he would wake her. Just as he had come to decision, the door to the stairway creaked open and a beam of light swept onto the floor. The light momentarily blinded him, but he was able to distinguish the silhouette of one person with very spiky hair standing frozen in the door. What the fuck are you two doing? Kaken's voice was a low growl that sent chills down Izuku's spine. If the room had been better lit, Izuku would have seen that his red eyes were narrowed to slits. Kaken, it's not what you think. Uraraka-san just fell asleep while we were sitting, nothing else. Izuku explained in a hushed tone, trying his best not to wake the sleeping girl on her shoulder. She didn't seem to have been disturbed, so now Izuku only had to convince the explosively tempered boy that he wasn't taking advantage of Uraraka. He didn't sound convinced and drawled out the sound. Bakugo shut the door behind him and stomped to the kitchen, and Izuku stared after him, puzzled by his reaction, or rather lack thereof. Katsuki had just wanted to get some water or juice to soothe his dry throat. He hadn't expected anyone to be up and sitting in the lounge area. Seeing Deku and Uraraka all cuddled up had rubbed him the wrong way and instantly worsened his mood. Grabbing a carton of milk instead, he poured the liquid into a glass and glanced over at the dark corner of the lounge where he could make out the shape of Deku. He was pretty damn sure the nerd was telling the truth, but he felt angry just looking at them. Why the fuck did Deku have to be sitting there and see him awake at this hour? Katsuki could care less why the shitty nerd and round face were sitting there, but he'd be damned if he let Deku see the dark circles under his eyes. It was bad enough that Kirishima kept pestering him about not getting enough sleep. He didn't want the shitrag to start crying about it too. Katsuki downed the milk and washed the glass before placing it back in the cupboard. The blonde ground his teeth and made his way back to the lounge so he could head back to his room. He preferred taking the stairs all the way up to his floor and saw it as effortless training rather than a tedious task. As he passed, he noticed that Deku was trying to untangle himself from Uraraka, and he couldn't help but growl in annoyance as he stalked out of the room and back to the staircase. Fricking Deku, always popping up everywhere. Katsuki just wanted to be in a nerd-free atmosphere, but no, even when the green-haired nerd was supposed to be sleeping, he was sitting there babysitting round face and doing God knows what. They could all go to hell. Katsuki had better things to do. Like sleeping. Izuku had wanted to explain the situation to Kaken, but the angry boy had gone to the kitchen and returned before Izuku could free himself from Uraraka's surprisingly strong grip on his arm. The blonde had left the room without a word, but had still sent a murderous glare in their direction. Izuku knew that Kaken wouldn't care why the two of them were in the common room instead of sleeping, but he still wanted to explain it to him. Sitting back, Izuku sighed in defeat. There was no getting through to Kaken no matter how hard he tried, and frankly, he didn't have the energy to deal with the blonde's temper. It was still dark out, but the sun would be rising in 2 hours. Izuku knew he needed to get some sleep and gently shook the brunette awake. He had been surprised that she didn't wake up when Bakugo appeared, but then again, her nerves had been on edge all day and she was probably still exhausted. He felt so bad for waking her up, but they had class in the morning and both needed to go to bed. Uraraka-san? At the sound of his voice, she stirred and let go of his arm. The brunette blinked at him owlishly and moved to the side to sit up straight. Deku-kun? Ochaco was disoriented and had no idea why she was with Deku in the common room. The last thing she remembered was lying in her own bed and waking up, with her heart in her throat. Then texting Deku to come downstairs. "I'm so sorry, did I fall asleep?" Ochaco looked out of the window, but she couldn't tell what time it was. It was still dark out, but it had been past midnight when she came down here, so it was probably really late. "Yeah, don't worry about it. We should probably get to bed soon, though." Midoriya replied and showed him his phone display which said it was past 3 in the morning. They both got up and Ochaco stretched her tired limbs before following Deku to the elevator. How long was I asleep? It had felt like she had just closed her eyes, but her stiff and aching body told her she had slept soundly for at least an hour while sitting upright. 2 hours? He said and looked at her over his shoulder, a soft expression on his face. He was glad to see that she wasn't jittery any longer. "I didn't mean to fall asleep. You should have woken me." The gravity user pouted and reached his side. He had already pressed the button and waited for the doors to open. Ochaco only then noticed the dark circles under his eyes and instantly felt bad for waking him in the middle of the night on a weekday. "Deku-dash, don't apologize." He cracked another half-smile at her as the doors opened and they entered, Ochaco wincing from the bright lights inside, but still trailing behind him. She noticed him suppressing a yawn and thought that he looked cute when he tried to hide it. No, that was not what she thought, absolutely not. She had just followed him into the elevator and was standing directly in front of the button panel, so when he reached over to press the buttons for the 2nd and 4th floor, his hand brushed her arm on the way and sent tingles down her skin. She tried to her best to suppress the shiver that ran through her body and desperately hoped he didn't notice. The sudden movement of the elevator sent her stumbling forward the tiniest bit and she stopped right in front of him. There was so little distance between them that she could count the freckles on his face. Ochaco noticed for a second time that night how the light reflected off of his eyes and she felt herself drawn to them. His eyes were always filled with emotions and she could always read his mood by locking eyes with him. Now though, she just wanted to look at them forever. Ochaco felt herself inching closer and his green eyes landed on hers, sending tiny shivers down her spine. Ochaco sucked in a breath and lowered her eyes to his lips. She just had to close the distance between them to touch her lips to his. Her fingers twitched with the urge to trace the outline of his lips, and she found herself spellbound. Ochaco raised her eyes once again and found Deku peering at her curiously. Her hand moved slowly and grabbed hold of his sleeve, and she leaned the tiniest bit forward before the ding of the elevator startled her out of her trance. Her hand snapped back as if burned, and she took a step back for good measure. "Are you okay?" Midoriya asked, concern filling his expression as he moved past her towards the door. Ochaco's cheeks burned in shame, and she quickly nodded. His arm was blocking the sensor in the door, and she wished he'd just hurry up and leave. "I'm fine. I'll see you tomorrow." She honestly just wanted to be swallowed up by a hole and disappear into the ground forever. Izuku finally moved away from the door and stepped out into the hallway. It was late and Uraraka was acting kind of out of it. She was probably delirious from having her sleep interrupted so frequently, so Izuku decided to let her retire to bed and ask her how she was feeling in the morning instead. "Good night," he said to her as the doors closed, blocking his view of her. Was it just him, or was her face looking a little red? Maybe she had a fever and was feeling dizzy, but her temperature had been normal when she had been leaning against him. Izuku shook his head and headed back to his room. Once the doors closed, Ochaco felt relief and guilt flood her. It didn't take her long to make it back to her room, but the moment she was inside, she shut the door and slid down with her back against the wood. Was she out of her mind? Had she actually thought about kissing Deku? What was happening to her? The thoughts swarmed inside her head, and she got up from the floor and climbed into bed, hoping that sleep would claim her and silence her mind. She wasn't that lucky. The thoughts buzzed around in her head, and she kept picturing Midoriya's face so close to hers. She had been so close. A little closer, and she could have experienced how his lips felt against hers. No, she couldn't think like that. They were just friends, nothing else. So why was her heart still racing? The following morning, Ochaco was at peace with herself. She had decided that last night's near incident was a result of her being sleep-deprived and on edge for so long. Deku, being her close friend, whom she confided in, just happened to be present at the moment of her insanity. Luckily, she hadn't acted on her impulses, and she was spared the embarrassment of her would-be action. That was why she had spent her morning practicing how to face Midoriya before heading for class. Of course, luck would have it that he was the only person she encountered outside. "Uraraka-san." "Good morning." Deku called out to her and hurried his pace to catch up with her. His tie was crooked, she noticed. "Good morning. Where's Ida-kun?" the brunette asked and ignored the fluttering sensation in her stomach. Their pace had slowed to a comfortable stroll, and time seemed to slow around them as they walked to the main campus. He had some papers to submit, so he went on ahead. "How are you feeling?" Green eyes locked onto hers and made her forget how to speak. Ochaco cleared her head and faced him head-on. "I'm fine. Thanks for staying up with me." She smiled brightly, actually feeling a lot better than the previous day. She was even feeling more energized because of the coffee she had taken to drinking in the morning. "You're welcome. I was thinking that we could head straight to the station after school today. Mom would like for you to stay for dinner." Deku flashed one of those smiles that made her knees feel weak, and she found herself agreeing in a heartbeat. "Sounds great," she replied, before the feeling of not wanting to impose on his mother appeared. She didn't get to say anything else before she was rudely interrupted. "Move." Bakugo all but snarled at them and forcefully strode right in between them, knocking shoulders with them both. He didn't even turn to look at them, or heaven forbid, apologize for walking into them, and just continued in a much faster pace. "What's his problem?" Ochaco muttered and rubbed her shoulder. There hadn't been much impact, but nevertheless, she disliked the feeling of purposely being bumped into. "I don't know. Are you okay?" Midoriya took hold of her arm and searched her face for signs of discomfort. Her hand found his, and she gave it a gentle squeeze before letting it fall back down. "Yeah. I guess I'm used to Bakugo being pissed for no reason, but he could at least watch where he is going," the brunette complained sourly. Taking a deep breath, she decided she didn't want to waste her energy on the moody teenager and instead focus on what made her happy. "That aside, I can't wait to see Coco." She was really looking forward to cuddling the kitty and couldn't wait for school to end. "I think you'll like her." Midoriya chuckled and they resumed walking, this time hurrying a bit more. They still had 10 minutes until the bell rang, but sped up anyway. I just remembered there is a place I want to stop by before we go to the station, is that okay? Ochaco had decided to bring a small gift, since it was the first time she was meeting his mother and she didn't want to come across rude. Sure. The rest of the day passed in a flash, with Ochaco ignoring the tingling feeling whenever Midoriya smiled at her and pretended her cheeks weren't flushed when he laughed at something she said. Before they knew it, the last bell rang and both teenagers headed out to their first stop. After finishing her purchase, Ochaco followed Midoriya to the train station. The whole train ride was spent chatting about classes, homework, training, friends, and everything that came to mind. Izuku felt nervous every time he thought about bringing a friend home. Uraraka was the first friend from high school that was going to be introduced to his mother, and it was freaking him out. He knew that his mom would adore the brunette, but he couldn't for the life of him figure out why he was feeling so damn nervous. Is something wrong? Uraraka tilted her head and studied him. He had been toying with the sleeve of his uniform, something he did when he felt anxious. It's the first time I'm bringing a friend over. I guess that I'm a little nervous, which is absurd, right? I mean, it is completely normal for high schoolers to bring friends home, so I have no reason to be nervous. I should just relax and Izuku's mutterstorm was interrupted when Uraraka, who was sitting beside him, placed a hand on his arm and told him to breathe. You didn't have many friends before 𝗳𝗏𝗍𝗍? Ochaco stated more than asked. She was aware how bad his relationship with Bakugo was, but surely he'd had other friends in middle school? I didn't have any real friends before you and Ida-kun. Most people avoided me or made fun of me. But don't worry about it. It's all in the past and we should focus on the present, right? Izuku veered off when he noticed the saddened expression that came over Uraraka. How could he tell her what a nightmare middle school had been when she got upset over hearing he hadn't had any friends? How would she react if he told her he'd been quirkless? Would she be disgusted? Pity him? Would she laugh at him? No, Uraraka wasn't like that. If she found out the truth about his childhood, she would be angry on his behalf. That was the type of person she was. She would never ridicule him for something that was out of his control. This is our stop, Izuku said, happy for the distraction. He didn't know why he was thinking about Uraraka's reaction and now wasn't the time to overanalyze. He would think about it later and figure out why it was affecting him so much. Over here, hurry. Izuku pulled Uraraka after him and breathed a sigh of relief when they reached the little shelter. It had started pouring rain out of nowhere and they had both taken off as fast as they could, but both managed to get soaked. Sorry, if I hadn't stepped into the store we could probably have avoided the rain. Ochaco tried to get her breathing under control. Her school uniform and flats weren't ideal for sprinting in and she sincerely wished she had brought an umbrella with her. Her hair was plastered to her face and she was soaking wet. It's not your fault, we couldn't have known it was going to rain. Izuku panted and leaned on the wall behind him. He should have checked the weather forecast before he went to school that morning, but he'd barely been awake. I hope it stops soon. I don't want to catch a cold. Uraraka muttered beside him and peeked out from the safety of the overhead shelter. The thumping sounds of the raindrops only increased in intensity and she was grateful they had found a shelter. We can stay here until it lets up, Izuku suggested and unzipped his bag. He was sure he had a hand towel in there somewhere. He could already feel the cold seep into his bones and looked forward to taking a hot shower and wear a sweater. He couldn't find the towel. They had been standing for close to 5 minutes when the rain finally cleared. Izuku led the way and told her stories about his childhood as they worked their way around his neighborhood. He had just pointed out the building their apartment was in when another shower hit them. Their damp clothes got drenched and Izuku grabbed Uraraka's hand and pulled her the rest of the way to his building. After a few flight of stairs, Izuku led her to a wooden door. Unlocking the door, he took off his shoes and gestured for Uraraka to follow him. Mom, I'm home, he called. Ochaco had just passed the door when a tiny mule made her look up and she came face to face with a plump woman with a softer version of Deku's features and the same green hair. Welko, oh you poor dears, you're soaking wet. She suddenly disappeared from sight and returned a second later with a bunch of towels in her arms. We got caught in the rain. Deku laughed and gratefully accepted the towel from his mother and handed Ochaco one. It was only then she remembered that she hadn't introduced herself. My name is Uraraka Ochaco, thank you for having me. Ochaco bowed and straightened up to see a smile form on the older woman's face. She looked so much like Deku when she smiled. "Where are my manners? Come in, I'm Izuku's mother, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏. Thank you for always taking care of my son." During the 5 minutes Ochaco had spent standing in the hallway, she had realized a couple of things. Her clothes weren't completely soaked, but still enough that she would likely catch a cold if she stayed in them. She should take off her jacket, which had offered her some protection. She didn't have any spare clothes in her bag, not even a sweater. The 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏s realized the same thing and started panicking about what to do. Deku was the spitting image of his mother. The list went on. "Uraraka-san, why don't you take a shower? I'll lay out something for you to wear," Deku's mother suggested. The kind woman had handed her a soft towel to initially dry herself off with, but upon noticing how wet the young girl's uniform was, she immediately wanted to hang it to dry. "Are you sure? And please, call me Ochaco," the brunette had replied. Her hair was a tangled, wet mess and she actually wouldn't mind a hot shower, but this was the first time she was meeting 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏-san, and she really didn't want to impose. "I insist. I don't want either of you to catch a cold." The kind lady frowned, looking from her son to his friend. She still had one towel draped over her arm and with determined eyes, she turned around and headed out of the entrance. "I agree. It's better if you get out of your wet clothes, Uraraka-san." Deku spoke up from beside her. At some point he had bent down and picked up something from the floor, and Ochaco finally noticed the purring mass of fur between his hands. "Coco!" She nearly squealed in delight. Ochaco had always loved animals and kitties were no exception. She stepped closer to Deku, who gently held out his palms where the kitten was curled up. Its dark eyes were looking closely at Ochaco as she approached. The kitten had dark gray-brown fur on its body and head, while its face and underbelly were completely white. She was small enough for Deku to hold her in both of his hands without dropping her, and she looked incredibly comfortable. Ochaco, who knew a thing or two about cats, stopped a few steps away and slowly turned her head to the side, revealing her neck. As a child, it had never quite understood the need for mutual respect between a human and a tiny cat, but now she knew better. If she was going to become a licensed hero in the near future, she would have to willingly put herself in situations where she was completely vulnerable and in danger. It was only a matter of coming out on top. As Ochaco turned her head back, she noticed Deku's gaze resting on her and she felt the urge to look away. A tiny meow could be heard and Coco the kitty leapt down from the green-haired teenager and down onto the floor. She slinked past Ochaco, but stopped momentarily and regarded the brunette. She was standing a few centimeters away, but cautiously moved forwards and sniffed the hand Ochaco had bent down to offer her. Seemingly satisfied, Coco turned around and padded out of the entrance. "What just happened?" Deku asked in a whisper. He had watched the interaction between the kitten and his friend, but hadn't quite understood its significance. He turned his eyes towards the brunette who had resumed patting her hair dry. "Coco decided I wasn't a threat. She'll probably come back when my clothes aren't dripping with water," Ochaco answered and pointed to the small gathering of water from where she had been standing still. "Oh," Deku grinned. He finally realized that they were still standing in the entryway and prompted Ochaco to follow him. After discarding her shoes, she followed the freckled boy inside the apartment and started looking around. The living room was moderately sized and was separated by a dining table which then led into the kitchen, like in their dorm. Ochaco had come to like the open-concept kitchen and living rooms, and the 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏's home was no exception. It was cozy and gave off a very soothing feel. The walls were decorated with pictures of Deku ranging from his time as a toddler and all the way up to the present. The couch had several pillows and a throw over one arm, which made Ochaco want to cuddle up next to someone and watch a movie. The coffee table was bare save for a box of tissues and the remote to the TV. She stepped closer to some of the pictures on a dresser next to the wall, and they were of Deku with his mother. They looked happy together, she realized. "Uraraka-san, the bath is ready?" Deku's voice popped into her head and stopped her quest to explore the living room. He came to a stop beside her and gave her a small smile when he noticed her looking at the pictures of him and his mom. They were some of his most treasured memories after all. "Oh," Ochaco cursed herself for stammering and tried her best to act normal when she looked up at him. A towel was slung over his shoulders and he had removed his jacket, which left him in his white shirt that had become transparent and was clinging to his body like second skin. Ochaco felt heat rush to her cheeks and tried her best to conceal the blush creeping up her face. It was no secret that most of the guys in Class 1A were well-built and lean, but seeing the toned muscles under Deku's shirt made her realize that he, too, was one of those guys. He didn't notice her turmoil and started leading her out of the room. She was grateful that Deku walked in front of her and wasn't able to see her reddening face. On the other hand, she had quite the view of his back and her eyes were glued to how his muscles stood out and shifted when he moved his arm to pat the rest of his hair dry. Ochaco's knees almost buckled. Deku suddenly stopped walking and she was centimeters from crashing into him before she straightened up. He had stopped in front of a door and was explaining to her how the shower worked, but she was barely listening. Now that the brunette was standing so close to him, she could feel the heat radiating off him and she realized that her body was feeling cold. The feeling of wanting to stand even closer to his heat snuck up on Ochaco and she nearly smacked herself. Thanking him, she hurried inside and shut the door behind her. What was going on? Ochaco couldn't understand why she was acting weird around Deku. He was just her friend, so why did it feel like her eyes only followed him? This wasn't the first time Ochaco had thought about wanting to be closer with the pile of freckles she called a friend. She had often found herself searching for his mop of green hair in a crowd and somehow she always ended up next to him. She was friends with Iida too, but she never felt nervous around him the same way she felt with Deku. "What's wrong with me?" Ochaco whispered to herself as she removed her clothes and stepped inside the shower cubicle. The taps were colored red and blue, so it was easy to adjust the temperature to her liking. She had a pretty good idea of what was going on with her, but she wasn't ready to accept it yet. If she acknowledged her feelings, there would be no going back and Ochaco didn't want to risk it. Her goal was to become a hero, she reminded herself, not to get a boyfriend. The warm water washed over her skin, and she felt the cold gradually disappear. There was nothing wrong with liking someone, and among the boys in their class, Deku was the sweetest and most heroic of all, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that she was starting to develop feelings for him. Still, Ochaco wasn't ready to say it out loud and pushed it to the back of her mind. She wasn't here to pine after Izuku, she was here to play with Coco. "You're only saying that because he isn't interested in you. You are playing it safe." A dark whisper sounded in her head. She had been caught off guard this time and was startled badly. Taking a deep breath, Ochaco braced herself for what was to come. "He'll never see you the same way and you know it. That's why you pretend you don't love him, but you know you do and I know you do." The voice dripped with venom and made her shiver despite the warm water. "You're so pitiful, Uraraka Ochaco. Always the second choice, never relied upon, never wanted. Even your parents sent you away because you are a burden. What makes you think you'll ever be good enough for him? He could have anyone he wanted, he wouldn't even look at you twice. He just pities you. You're nothing." Ochaco did her best to ignore the painful words, but still sank to her knees. The water that had been soothing before now felt scalding and she found it hard to breathe. Ochaco started sobbing as the words repeated themselves in her head. It was her own voice she heard. A few days after the villain ambush, she had started hearing her darkest thoughts that she normally dismissed. The intensity of the voice depended on how well she was feeling, and right now, she was able to slowly shut it out. She had learned that physical pain made the voice fade, so she had started digging her nails into her palms when she couldn't handle it. Ochaco knew it was wrong, but the pain in her palms felt like nothing compared to the way her dark voice cut through her. She was aware that it was an after effect of the villain poison and she had decided that she was going to report it, but every time she picked up her phone to call Ryukyu, she chickened out. How could she explain that she was hearing voices that knew her darkest secrets without everyone thinking she was nuts? She was still building up the courage to tell the doctors, but until she did, she would have to deal with the voice on her own. Ochaco breathed in and held her breath for a few seconds to slow her heart rate. The water was still running down her body and she tried to focus on the paths it took across her skin. The seconds ticked by and she exhaled deeply before she repeated the process a few more times. Once she had calmed down, the brunette got up from the floor and turned off the water, letting the last few droplets run down her skin. Her eyes stung a little from a mixture of water and tears, But other than that she was fine. Her palms hadn't been harmed and she was glad she had been able to come back to her senses. Stepping out of the shower and onto the floor mat, Ochaco finally noticed what Midoriya-san had laid out for her to wear. It was a pair of soft pajama bottoms and a long-sleeved shirt that looked too big for her. Still, it was better than putting on her wet uniform, so after drying off, she started getting dressed. She had been right. The shirt was too big for her and kept slipping down her shoulder, and the pants were a bit too long, but they were dry and comfortable. An extra towel had been laid out for her and Ochaco got to work on drying her hair. As soon as she exited the bathroom, a meow sounded from the floor and she was surprised to see Coco staring expectantly at her. Ochaco bent down and extended her hand towards the cat, who was trilling, and swiftly moved to nuzzle her head against the brunette's hand. Ochaco smiled and picked up the kitty before cuddling her close to her chest. Coco purred contently and let her head rest against where Ochaco's heart would be. "I see you've become friends." Midoriya-san spoke from behind Ochaco. The brunette turned around and saw the older woman looking at her with a soft expression on her face. "She's a sweetheart," Ochaco replied and cuddled the kitty even closer. Coco's eyes were turned up towards her and she stretched up to press her snout to the brunette's face. "Would like some tea, Ochaco?" Deku's mom asked her, and Ochaco was reminded of her own mother from the way her name was said. "Yes please, Midoriya-san. If I'm going to call you by your first name, you have to call me Inko as well." The kind woman smiled again, and Ochaco couldn't figure out if she was being serious or not. Knowing her son, she probably was. "Okay, Inko-san. Where's Midoriya-kun?" Ochaco stopped herself from calling him Deku. She wasn't sure how his mother would react, and they had agreed it was probably better if she called him by his real name, but it was going to be harder than she thought. "He's in his room down the hall. Could you please get him? The tea is almost ready," Inko-san asked of her and pointed to where she would find his room. As Ochaco trod down the hallway, almost tripping over her pants, Coco mewed once before jumping down to the floor and taking the lead. The kitty looked over its shoulder once to make sure Ochaco was following her and marched on. The second Ochaco saw his door, she felt a smile creep up her face. An All Might nameplate was hanging on the door and spelled Izuku. She wondered how old he had been when he got it, and proceeded to knock on the door that had been left slightly open. Coco had already pushed it open and Ochaco followed the cat into a gallery devoted to All Might and some other top heroes. "I think this'll fit her better, Mom." Deku was rummaging through a drawer and spoke when he heard her enter. "You really are a fanboy." Ochaco chuckled when Deku jumped at the sound of her voice. He dropped whatever had been in his hands and his face turned beet red. Uraraka-san." Izuku wanted to die from embarrassment. First of all, his room. Secondly, he had thought it was his mother who had entered his room, not a brunette who could manipulate gravity at will. That was probably what had happened, Izuku figured. Uraraka-san had walked in and used her quirk to make his embarrassment feel 20 times heavier. Wait, could she even do that? Did her quirk only allow her to make things weightless, or could she also increase the gravitational force on them? "Man, you really are passionate about becoming a hero." Uraraka laughed lightly, making Izuku's face explode from heat. He was pretty sure steam was coming out of his ears by now. "I have wanted to become a hero ever since I was a child. I kept the posters to remind myself of my idols and as motivation. I'm so embarrassed." The speed of Izuku's words nearly broke the sound barrier, but it seemed like Uraraka had caught everything since she was able to reply. "Why are you embarrassed? It looks almost identical to your room at the dorm." Uraraka tilted her head sideways, looking puzzled. Right? He had forgotten that nearly everyone in his class had seen his walls plastered with posters and numerous figures scattered about. Izuku just thanked the heavens he hadn't brought his All Might bed sheets with him to his dorm room. That would have been a disaster. "So this is your old room?" Uraraka stepped deeper into the room and looked around curiously. Coco meowed from the middle of the bed where she had climbed up and was lounging. "Why, It felt odd to have someone other than his mother inside his room. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he had brought a friend over or if he ever had. He could feel himself fidgeting. "It's nice." Uraraka turned and smiled softly at him, making his knees weak. Her smile was so pretty and it always caught him off guard. Looking for a distraction, Izuku glanced away and spotted the article of clothing he had been searching for before she came in. Mom thought her clothes might be too big on you, so I figured this would probably fit better. He trailed off as his face turned redder. Izuku had picked up the hoodie off the floor and was holding it out to her, when he noticed that Uraraka's borrowed shirt had slipped down her shoulder and left it bare. Uraraka seemed to notice that as well and quickly pulled the shirt back up, a flush coloring her cheeks. Thanks. Ochaco's voice was a little high-pitched and she probably grabbed the hoodie a little too fast, suddenly very eager to wear it. She seemed to struggle a little with getting it over her head, but after wriggling around a little she had it sorted out. The light gray hoodie was snug against her chest and the sleeves covered most of her hands, but it was soft and warm. It also smelled like Deku, much to Ochaco's delight. It was a clean and subtle scent that tickled her nose when she inhaled. She sighed quietly in content, which Izuku mistook for a defeated sigh. Uraraka-san. Is everything all right? Your eyes are kind of red. The green-haired teen hesitantly reached a hand out and lightly touched the side of the brunette's face. His fingers felt cool to the touch. Why, I just, got shampoo in my eye? Ochaco finished lamely as Deku's hand dropped back to his side. She already knew that he wouldn't buy her white lie, but now was not the time to have that conversation. She was fine now, and she promised herself that she would come clean and tell him, but they couldn't talk about it here and now. She caught another whiff of his scent from his hoodie and continued. I'm fine honestly, but there is something I need to discuss with you, but not right now. Ochaco insisted and looked straight into his eyes. She could see that his worry subsided a little, but also that he wasn't entirely happy with having to wait. Coco trilled again from her spot on the bed and reminded the brunette why she was there in the first place. Oh, that's right. Your mom said that the tea was almost ready 5 minutes ago. Ochaco walked over to the bed and picked up the kitty who purred contently at being carried. Izuku took that as a sign that the conversation was over and he remembered that he was still in his wet clothes. Okay, I'll just take a quick shower. Will you be okay on your own? Deku frowned and looked so worried, Ochaco couldn't help but laugh. Of course I'll be. Your mother is so sweet and I also have Coco with me. At the mention of her name, the kitten meowed in agreement. That seemed to put Deku at ease and he promised to be back in 5 minutes. Ochaco left his room and headed back towards the living room where she could hear Inko-san rummaging around. On the way, the brunette noticed another framed picture hanging on the wall of a tiny Deku, a younger-looking Inko-san and a male who didn't look familiar at all. It's probably Deku's father. He really takes after Inko-san. She thought to herself and noticed how many points of resemblance there were between mother and son. They looked alike, save for Midoriya's curly hair, and their personalities were similar as well. The only noticeable difference was Deku's self-sacrificial tendencies and his mother's constant worry for her only son. Well, he was also worrying constantly about others, so really, it was a matter of perspective. Coco stretched her tiny limbs and nimbly jumped out of Ochaco's grasp. The brunette followed the kitten as it darted across the floor and led her into the kitchen. Coco purred when she came to a stop at Inko-san's feet. The plump woman picked up the cat and cooed at her, before she noticed Ochaco standing a few paces away. Please have a seat, Ochaco, I'll bring the tea right away. She smiled and went back to setting the table. There was a plate of biscuits in the middle of the table and a cup was placed in front of Ochaco after she sat down. Thank you. Midoriya-kun told us to go ahead and start while he showered. She informed Inko-san. Coco, who had been out of sight for a few seconds, snuck up on Ochaco and jumped onto her lap. The kitten had decided that Ochaco was a great place for taking a nap and her tiny ribcage rose and fell under Ochaco's fingers. She made sure not to touch the cat with the pads of her fingers and stroked her fur with the rest of her hand. How is school going? Izuku told me you also are doing an internship along with your studies. Inko-san asked after sitting down and grabbing her own steaming cup of tea. She gestured for Ochaco to start on her tea and waited with a smile for her reply. I am, and it's been a bit hard to balance both studying and working at Ryukyu's place, but I'm managing somehow. The young girl explained. Now that she thought about it, she had constantly been busy and couldn't remember the last time she had taken a day off. You have to be careful not to overwork yourself. I know you all are incredibly busy, but you need some time to recover or you'll burn yourself out soon. 𝗵𝗃 frowned, and in that moment she looked exactly like Izuku, but at the same time she reminded Ochaco of her own mother. It was scary how she verbalized what Ochaco had been thinking. Sort of. I haven't been that good at taking care of myself lately, Ochaco admitted and took a sip of her tea. After a few moments she continued. It's so easy to get caught up in everything. I mean, just a few months ago I was in middle school and now it's all about saving the world and constantly improving my skills. I want to be a hero, I really do, but sometimes it feels like I won't be ready by the time we graduate. How do you know when you are ready to be a real hero and save people's lives? When will I be sure that I am qualified to be a hero? She hadn't noticed how much she had said, and by the time she realized she couldn't backpedal. Why did she have to say that? She hadn't intended to sound so doubting of herself. Ochaco desperately tried to think of what to say to diffuse the situation, but 𝗵𝗃-san beat her to it. I think the only qualification you need is the will to help other people. The rest comes with time, confidence, and experience. 𝗵𝗃-san smiled, that warm motherly smile that made Ochaco want to run over and throw herself on her lap, sobbing. She didn't, of course, but she felt like she wanted to cry. Deku's mother had made it sound so simple, and maybe it really was. Ochaco started to feel lightheaded. She had spent weeks thinking that she was lacking resolve and power, but what she really was lacking was experience, and she couldn't just achieve that overnight. It would take her years to become experienced in the field. Of course, she wasn't going to be ready in a few months. It was going to take more time, more practice, and more determination. It really was that simple, and she felt so stupid for even opening her mouth. 𝗵𝗃-san must have noticed her embarrassment, because the next time she spoke, she was looking over at some of the pictures hanging on the wall. I'm sure you've noticed how badly Izuku wants to be a hero. I can't remember him ever wanting to do anything else with his life. When he was 4 or 5 years old, he used to gather all the pillows and cushions he could find around the house and pretend they were people. He would place them on the table and act like a hero, saving passengers from a sinking ship or getting them out of a burning building. Not once did he tire of being the hero, no matter how hard achieving his dream was. He struggled for so many years, but my baby never gave up. He worked harder than anyone else and pushed himself to the point of breaking many times. Just look at him now. He attends 𝗧𝗼𝗃, one of the most prestigious schools in all of Japan, and not once has he looked back. I know he'll become a wonderful hero. Wonderful hero. Oh, both will. 𝗵𝗃-san was beaming with pride, and Ochaco couldn't help but share a smile with her. Her unwavering confidence in her son was amazing, and it wasn't hard to understand why the older woman felt that way. Deku had always rushed in to save anyone who needed help. It didn't matter if he knew them or not, he would always push past his limits in order to save them. His strength and his confidence made it easy to believe in him, and his compassion was so incredible that it made others feel like they weren't doing enough. Ochaco remembered having a conversation with Momo along those lines and renewed her resolve to work harder and do more good. Coco, who had been snoozing peacefully, yawned and stretched her limbs. Her tiny tail was flicking around in the air, and the cat's ears perked up. She meowed a few times and cuddled closer to Ochaco, who hugged the cat to her chest and ran her fingers down its spine. Coco purred in response and nestled herself into the crook of Ochaco's arm. She is getting attached to you, 𝗵𝗃-san remarked, a little surprised by how easily the young girl had befriended the cat. Coco wasn't by any means shy, but she was usually a little apprehensive when meeting new people. The only other person she had warmed up to instantly was Izuku, and that was likely because of how much he resembled 𝗵𝗃. I had a cat when I was younger. She passed away a few years ago and I never got another, Ochaco explained. Even though it had been years, she still missed her orange tabby. Pets held a special place in their owners' hearts that could never be filled. Coco was actually doing a pretty good job of making a space for herself in Ochaco's heart. As if she had heard the brunette's thoughts, she purred again and nuzzled her head against her arm. Sorry, it took longer than expected. Deku's voice sounded from behind Ochaco and startled her slightly. She hadn't heard him enter, but she had also been engrossed in conversation. Had he overheard what they had been talking about? Ochaco looked up to see if he showed any signs of having eavesdropped, but he wasn't fidgeting or avoiding her gaze, so she assumed he hadn't heard anything. Did you dry your hair properly, honey? 𝗵𝗃 asked and poured him a cup of tea, which he gratefully accepted and started sipping immediately. He sighed as the warmth spread inside him and slumped down on the seat next to Ochaco. Yes, Mom. What's for dinner? Izuku asked as he placed both hands around the cup to warm his fingers. He should probably go grab a sweater since he still felt a little cold. He glanced to the side and saw Uraraka sipping her tea and in his hoodie and thought she looked good even in that. She looked very comfortable, as did the cat curled up on her lap. I was thinking of fried rice. Is that okay with you, Ochaco? 𝗵𝗃 addressed the younger girl, who had a contemplative look on her face. She perked up a little at the mention of food, and 𝗵𝗃 chuckled at how readily she agreed. Do you need any help? Midoriya-kun and I have been practicing with our friends. Ochaco smiled brightly, suddenly feeling very cheerful. She felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders with just a simple sentence and wanted to do something. We can help you, Mom. Izuku also piped in, smiling as brightly as his friend. I couldn't ask a guest to help with the food. Deku's mother looked horrified at the idea, but changed her mind when she saw both teenagers deflating. She was a sucker for puppy eyes and eager teenagers. You know what? I can teach you how to make the best garlic fried rice ever. Then you can cook it for your other friends? She suggested, and both teenagers cheered. I'm so nervous about the math quiz next week, Uraraka exclaimed as they helped Izuku's mom prepare for dinner. The teenagers were prepping vegetables while 𝗵𝗃 readied the rest. We can go over some of the topics again if you like, Izuku offered. He and Todoroki had planned to solve some problems over the weekend to practice, and he was sure the hybrid quirk user wouldn't mind Uraraka joining them. Really? Uraraka looked at him with stars in her eyes, and the knife nearly slipped out of his grasp. She was standing so close to him that her hair tickled him whenever she moved her head. Sure. Izuku laughed and returned to chopping up the carrots he had in front of him. He could faintly feel his mother's gaze on his back, but he pretended not to notice. Uraraka didn't seem to notice that his mom was observing them quietly, and he hoped it would stay that way. He didn't want her to be embarrassed by his mom, when he knew that she meant well. They discussed some of the topics Uraraka wanted to revise for a few minutes, before the aspiring hero noticed that his mom had gone quiet and had her back to him. What's wrong, Mom? Izuku asked as he watched his mother hastily rummaging around the shelves of the refrigerator. He stopped chopping carrots and placed the knife on the cutting board before walking over to his mom, who was looking confused. I'm sure I had taken shrimp out to thaw, but I can't find it anywhere. 𝗵𝗃 remembered pulling the bag out of the freezer and placing it inside the fridge very clearly. She just couldn't see it anywhere. We can just leave out the shrimp? Uraraka suggested, coming to stand next to Izuku. She didn't mind that there was no shrimp. The brunette loved fried rice in any way, shape or form. I guess so. 𝗵𝗃 frowned. She really couldn't understand what had happened to the shrimp, but she'd make do without it. That was until Izuku spoke and surprised her. I'll go to the store and get some more, Mom. He volunteered and was already halfway out of the kitchen before she could even react. 𝗵𝗃 smiled at her son's retreating back. He had always been like that. He's always like that, isn't he? Ochaco was looking in the direction as 𝗵𝗃 when she voiced 𝗵𝗃's thoughts. The brunette's expression had softened to something fond and caring. 𝗵𝗃 didn't dare call it anything else lest it be wrong, but she had an inkling that something was going on between her son and the young girl. She was a woman and a mother to boot, so her intuition was usually spot on. Did Izuku ever mention how I got Coco? 𝗵𝗃 turned to the brunette with a smile of her own. She wasn't sure Izuku had told anyone how they came to look after Coco. He was too humble to do that. No, he just told me that you had always wanted to own a cat. Ochaco thought back to the first time she had seen the picture of Coco, but she could only recall Deku saying as much. Izuku has always had this penchant for finding and saving lost pets. Coco's mother was one of the neighborhood strays that Izuku knew and sometimes even fed. There was a storm a few months ago and he found her trapped under some iron pipes near a construction site on his way home. Of course, Izuku heard her cries and came to her rescue. He took her to a shelter and made sure she got medical attention, and then he found out she was carrying a litter. He helped take care of her and even printed out flyers to help with adoption for the kittens after they were born. The only kitty that wasn't adopted was Coco, and Izuku was so sad about her not finding a new home that he convinced me to adopt her. 𝗵𝗃𝗀's heart swelled with pride as she retold the story. He might still be her baby, but to that family of cats he was a true hero. What about Coco's mother? Ochaco asked and tried to spot the furry little creature that seemed to have gone into hiding. 𝗵𝗃𝗀san looked out the window with a thoughtful smile on her face. She still roams the neighborhood. She wasn't much for being domesticated, but her kittens all have a nice home now. Isn't that right, Coco? 𝗵𝗃𝗀 cooed and bent down to pet the cat that had appeared out of nowhere. The kitty meowed loudly in response and rubbed her head against 𝗵𝗃𝗀's hand. That is very much like him. Everyone in our class agrees that he is a natural-born hero. Ochaco shared with his mother and noticed how the older woman's eyes dimmed a little. She swiped at her eyes quickly and turned back to Ochaco with what seemed to be a burning question at the tip of her tongue. She seemed to be struggling with herself for a few moments, but finally her shoulders sagged and she asked, "Is Izuku having trouble adjusting at the dorm? Or is there anyone in your class that he doesn't get along with?" 𝗵𝗃𝗀 started to wring her hands together in worry. She had wanted to question the brunette all day, but with Izuku there, she couldn't get herself to bring up his social life. She didn't want to hurt her son, she just had to ask to lessen her worries. No? Well, there is Bakugo, but no one really gets along with him. Why do you ask? Ochaco was surprised that Deku's mother was asking her this. She had gotten the impression that Deku was very close with his mother and had expected him to share such details with her. It's just, Izuku has been looking so lively lately whenever he talks about you and Ida-kun, and because he seems so genuinely happy, I just want to make sure that he isn't pretending for my sake again. It was very hard for me to agree to let him live at the dorm. I just can't stand the thought of him pretending to be fine and be all alone. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 was starting to sniffle. She hadn't meant to spring the question on Ochaco like that, but when she brought up how their class viewed him, she couldn't help it. She so desperately needed to know that someone was looking after her baby, when she wasn't around. Is everything all right, 𝗵𝗃𝗀san? Ochaco tentatively stepped closer and placed a comforting hand on the now weeping woman's arm. I'm sorry, I just haven't seen my baby so happy in a long time and I don't want his happiness to be a pretense. The green-haired woman had produced a tissue out of thin air and was dabbing at her eyes. Why do you say that? Midoriya-kun is well liked by everyone in our class and I'm sure everyone will tell you that he is their friend. Except for Bakugo, Ochaco thought to herself but didn't say out loud. Deku's mother took some steadying breaths before she looked into Ochaco's eyes with so much sorrow that it made the brunette want to cry along with her. I can't ask Izuku these things anymore. He'll just say that he is fine and happy to make me stop worrying, but I don't think he really trusts me. 𝗵𝗃𝗀's eyes welled with tears again. She had been carrying around guilt and a very small hope ever since he started attending UA. The guilt stemmed from not knowing about the incidents that had occurred at school more often than was normal and hoped that his horrible school experience wasn't holding him back. She had never been able to stop him from being bullied, which he had only recently opened up to her about, but she had known her son was shy and wasn't good at making friends. In the beginning she hadn't realized that he was shunned for being quirkless, but when she became aware of it, she had attended many meetings with Izuku's teachers to make his situation easier. It wasn't like he was completely isolated socially, but a lot of people thought of him as being lesser for not possessing any extraordinary power. The stigma around being quirkless was not something that would disappear easily, but 𝗵𝗃𝗀 wanted the world to acknowledge her son for being amazing despite not wielding a quirk. She had tried to forget the one instance where she failed him so many years ago, but to this day it still haunted her. No matter how much she tried to be involved in Izuku's life, she felt like that one time had made Izuku stop trusting her and it broke her heart. "Oh-san. 𝗵𝗃𝗀san?" Ochaco had been calling her name a few times when she was snapped out of her reverie. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 had no idea how long she had been lost in thought, but the young girl in front of her looked borderline nervous. "What do you mean he doesn't trust you? Did something happen to Midoriya-kun?" The brunette had a bad feeling about the direction their conversation was taking. Izuku's quirk developed very late. It was some sort of mutation. When he was 4 years old and still hadn't manifested a quirk, I took him to a doctor who believed him to be quirkless. You know how Izuku always wanted to be a hero? I didn't believe he could become a hero without a quirk, and I think it hurt him more than he ever let on. I think it created a rift between us, but he never stopped believing in himself, and I'm so proud of him for it." Ochaco's eyes widened in disbelief when she heard 𝗵𝗃𝗀's confession. She had known that something hadn't been right about Deku's overpowered quirk that kept getting him hurt, but she hadn't realized it was because he still wasn't familiar with it. Everyone, including herself, wrote it off as his quirk simply being too strong to control. How horrible must it have been to be a child and constantly be told he wasn't cut out for his dream. She knew how quirkless persons were treated as extreme anomalies, and she prayed that Izuku hadn't been victim to any of the horrible things she had heard people did to the quirkless. Many of them were exaggerated, she knew, but she didn't want to believe that her kind-hearted friend had ever been hurt. Her gut feeling, however, told her that he hadn't been so lucky. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." 𝗵𝗃𝗀 apologized and put a hand on the brunette's shoulder. Ochaco shook her head and bit down on her lower lip, debating whether or not she should ask something that had been on her mind for some days now. "May I ask something?" She hesitated for another second, unsure if she should bring it up or leave it be, but when 𝗵𝗃𝗀 nodded, she continued. "Midoriya-kun didn't have many friends, did he?" At 𝗵𝗃𝗀's crestfallen expression, Ochaco's theory was confirmed. His loneliness hadn't only been a result of Midoriya being socially awkward, but it had also been due to other people being apprehensive. She still couldn't believe that anyone would judge his character based on a missing quirk, when he was much more than that. Midoriya Izuku was one of the purest human beings Ochaco had ever met. He was so inherently kind that she had trouble believing how harsh his childhood had been. She was extremely grateful that he hadn't become bitter and still yearned to become a hero. "On the day of Yue's entrance exam, he saved me from one of the giant robots you saw in the sports festival. Some rubble had fallen over me and everyone was running away, everyone except for Midoriya-kun, who jumped in to save me. After that we became friends. It was so easy." Ochaco smiled as she thought back to her first meeting with the nervous wreck that had been her Deku. While she spoke, she noticed how 𝗵𝗃𝗀's shoulders finally relaxed. "That being said, I don't think you have any reason to think he doesn't trust you. The way he talks about you, it is so easy to see that you are the most important person to him. From my perspective, he glosses over details and only keeps things to himself, because he knows how much you worry about his safety." She explained as kindly as she could. Constant worry was a strong hereditary trait in the Midoriyas, but Deku always spoke so highly of 𝗵𝗃𝗀 that she didn't believe for one second that he didn't trust her. Ochaco forgot to continue speaking, but it turned out it wasn't necessary. When the brunette looked up, Deku's mother was smiling again. "I'm glad he met you and Ida-kun. Speaking of which, next time you come over you should bring him as well." "I'd love to meet him." The stress lines on 𝗵𝗃𝗀's face had lessened and she looked relieved as well as overjoyed. Only when the front door opened and Izuku announced his return, 𝗵𝗃𝗀 and Ochaco remembered that they had been making dinner. Their conversation had made them forget the time, but they were both glad they had been able to talk so freely with each other. The curly-haired teenager stepped into the kitchen with a bag in his hand and walked straight to the counter to take out his purchases. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 mentally noted to do something nice for Ochaco as a thank you and promptly set about teaching the two young people how to make the fried rice. "Sorry it took so long, there were so many people out buying groceries," Izuku explained as he finished putting things away. He turned and stopped moving when he saw his mother and Uraraka exchange glances. He looked from one to the other without figuring out what had transpired between the two females while he had been out. "That's okay, honey. Ochaco and I finally had some girl time together." 𝗵𝗃𝗀 winked in Ochaco's direction and the brunette giggled at Deku's confused expression. He had only been gone for some 20 minutes, but he had missed so much. Coco meowed in protest over being left out of girl time. She had, after all, been present the whole time. It was late in the evening when Izuku and Uraraka finally got up to head back to the dorm after a delicious meal. The commute would take them nearly an hour, and although they didn't have school the following day, they still had to go to bed at a reasonable time. "It was wonderful meeting you, Ochaco. I hope you'll come by again." 𝗵𝗃𝗀 smiled at the girl, now dressed in her uniform again. She had thoroughly enjoyed the brunette's company and genuinely wanted her to visit again. "Thank you so much for having me." Ochaco bowed slightly and also thanked Inko-san for letting her borrow the clothes. She would never admit it, but she had been a little reluctant to return Deku's hoodie to him. It had been warm, and she had liked the way she could catch a whiff of his scent occasionally. The brunette realized she sounded like a pervert and stopped thinking about his hoodie. "Bye, Mom." Izuku hugged his mother briefly and petted Coco's head before leading the way out. Ochaco turned and waved to the kitty and her owner before she followed her classmate out. The walk to the train station was spent in companionable silence for the first few minutes. Then Ochaco asked a question about where Izuku had met Coco's mother, and he flushed when he figured out that his mother had told her the story. He just hoped Uraraka hadn't heard any embarrassing stories from his childhood. He had no idea. They talked the rest of the way to the station. About dinner, Izuku's mom, Ochaco's parents, school, and their friends. There was never really an awkward moment between them, Ochaco realized. She had always found Midoriya so easy to approach and to strike up a conversation with. She had never paid attention to his social skills around others. Now that she thought about it, he had managed to befriend the aloof Todoroki, who interacted minimally with others. Their friendship was something that had just fallen into place after the sports festival and internship. She was happy that Deku was making friends on his own and that no one befriended him out of pity. The girls in their class often had lengthy discussions about their male classmates, and more than once, they had mentioned how Todoroki had opened up to their class after becoming friends with Ida and Midoriya. Ochaco suspected that Todoroki had seen his own loneliness reflected in Deku, although the freckled teenager was good at hiding his past. She had also decided not to pry and wait for him to open up about his childhood. "I think my mom liked having another female to keep her company," Midoriya spoke as they waited for their train. In the light of a nearby lamp, his dark circles looked more prominent than ever, and Ochaco hoped they didn't take too long to get home. She was also beginning to feel the first signs of fatigue. It felt like the day had gone on for almost 3 weeks. She was so nice. Coco was sweet too. "Thank you for bringing me along today." Ochaco moved to stand beside him when she heard the train approach, and she was suddenly very aware of their arms being pressed together. "You're welcome," she heard him reply as the sound of the train coming to a stop increased. Deku grabbed hold of her hand as the doors to the compartment opened in front of them. They waited for the passengers to depart from the train before the two students boarded. It didn't take them long to find 2 empty seats to occupy for the duration of the train ride, and both slumped down. Izuku let go of her hand once they were sitting, but Ochaco had noticed the faint flush on his face. He was getting better at casual touches and initiated them more often, but his embarrassment was as cute as ever. The train started moving forward, and Izuku found himself being pressed closer to Uraraka as the speed increased. The brunette didn't seem to mind, or she didn't notice, but to him it was hard to focus on anything else. He needed a distraction, he decided. Izuku started looking out of the window opposite of him and watched the buildings pass by underneath the tracks. It didn't take long for his eyelids to start drooping, and his resolve to keep looking out of the window weakened as his desire to sleep increased. Izuku fought for a few minutes but lost the battle and finally closed his eyes. He could feel body growing heavy, but faintly registered Uraraka taking hold of his hand and rubbing circles on the back of his hand before he dozed off. The rest of the train ride had gone by slowly. Ochaco had spent the time thinking about her meeting with Deku's mother and the things she had found out about him. She was still having a hard time grasping it all. If Midoriya's quirk only developed the previous year, he hadn't had much time to train it before applying for the hero course, and he had still ranked 7th in the entrance exam. She admired him more and more for every day that passed, but she also couldn't help the anguish she felt on his behalf. He hadn't outright told her, but judging from his nature and the way he reacted to Bakugo's presence, Ochaco was almost certain that he had been bullied. She had thought about it before, but now that she knew he hadn't always had a quirk, the probability was even higher. It would also explain his skittish nature and his lack of confidence. Kids could be horrible, and she could only imagine the hardships he must have suffered for being born different. Sneaking a glance at her snoozing friend, Ochaco was relieved he had held on to his dream of becoming a hero. He looked so peaceful when he was asleep, it was hard to believe that this was the same person who had nightmares and worked harder than anyone to fight the evil of the world. Ochaco's eyes lingered on his face while they sat. From here she could count his freckles and trace the outline of his jaw with her eyes. She had to admit that he was good-looking and possessed tons of boyish charm that made her knees weak. His fingers moved and made her look down at his hand that she was still holding, and her eyes found their way to the scars on his right hand and forearm. The brunette didn't want to think about how he had gained all his scars, so she checked the time and began waking him up instead. "Deku-kun?" she whispered and tapped his shoulder a few times. His eyelids fluttered open and locked onto hers, and for a moment Ochaco forgot what she was doing, but then he blinked and ended her trance. Deku brought a hand up and rubbed his face tiredly. "We have to get off soon, so I thought I would wake you," Ochaco explained and watched as he rolled his shoulders a few times. "Thanks," he muttered and closed his eyes again, breathing deeply. Ochaco was afraid he was falling asleep again, but then Midoriya took a deep breath and stretched as best as he could in the small space they were occupying. "Strange, I don't even remember falling asleep." He smiled sheepishly and scratched his head. Looking up at the brunette beside him, Izuku noticed that their hands were still in contact. His fingers were half curled around Uraraka's smaller ones, but she made no move to remove them, so Izuku left his hand where it was, trying his best not to short-circuit. "You only slept for 20 minutes? Uraraka replied and caught his attention. She sounded distracted, Izuku thought, and looked at her curiously. She was looking down at her lap with the same troubled expression she had been wearing for the past few hours. "Is something wrong?" Izuku wanted to know. He hoped he hadn't offended her or said anything rude, but he wasn't sure what it could have been. Maybe she was feeling troubled because he dragged her to his house and had her meet his mom on such short notice, or maybe he hadn't been a very good host. "I don't know," Uraraka replied and looked up at him. She looked as though something was on her mind, and he was just about to ask if it had been something he had said, when their stop was announced over the speakers. Frowning, Izuku got up and walked over to the automatic doors with Uraraka trailing behind him. The train slowly came to a stop and the doors opened, letting the two students out onto the platform where other passengers boarded. It would take them around 15 minutes to walk back to their dorm, but the sun hadn't set yet, so Izuku thought it would be easier to talk somewhere away from the dorm. He couldn't stand seeing her bothered by anything. "There's a park nearby where we can talk," he suggested quietly. Uraraka seemed to consider it for a moment and then nodded, so he started leading the way. They were quiet while they walked, but for once it wasn't a comfortable silence that engulfed them. Ironically, the silence felt deafening to Izuku, but he didn't feel much for making small talk. Instead, he resigned himself to walking in silence while trying to figure out what was on Uraraka's mind. Once they found a bench to sit on, he waited for her to start talking, but she seemed to be content to just sit in silence. He was just about to ask her what was on her mind when she spoke. "Deku-kun, were you bullied in school?" Her question made Izuku freeze up. He had tried his best to hide the truth about his school years before UA and had been somewhat confident that he had succeeded. So why was she asking him this now? "Your mom told me your quirk developed late," Uraraka quietly said and watched him try to formulate a sentence. She had completely taken him by surprise and he couldn't seem to find his voice. He was too embarrassed to confirm it and couldn't deny it either. Izuku struggled to answer. What was he supposed to tell her? "Yeah, I was bullied by other kids that thought I was worthless because I didn't have a quirk. Once I was told to jump off the school roof and I still dream about it, but enough about me, how are you doing?" His face must have revealed what he was thinking, because Uraraka seemed to have caught on without words being needed. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she whispered, and Izuku noticed that her voice shook slightly. What was more surprising though was that her eyes shone with unshed tears that were threatening to spill onto her cheeks. "Uraraka-san?" Izuku felt a surge of alarm, but tried to push it down. It wouldn't do if he started panicking and upset the brunette further. She sniffled and swiped furiously at her eyes. "I know how people without quirks are treated, and I'd hate it if you had experienced any of it. You don't deserve it." Her voice was raw with emotion, and Izuku had to bite down hard on his lip to stop it from quivering. His chest constricted and he had to fight to control his voice. "What do you mean?" Izuku whispered hoarsely. "There was a man in my neighborhood who would say hi to everyone and give the kids treats and help everyone out no matter the task. But he was quirkless, and at first I didn't know what it meant, But as I grew up I realized that people looked down on him for no reason. And I would get so frustrated because he was so nice, but I could see it in the way people looked at him that they didn't want to have much to do with him, and I can't imagine how horrible it must have been for you if you grew up like that too. Uraraka was openly sobbing now and tears were also falling from Izuku's eyes. Luckily, they were sitting in a secluded part of the park and no one was around. It's true. I was bullied. Izuku managed to croak out despite the lump in his throat. It was painful to say out loud, but seeing how much Uraraka was hurting on behalf of him, he wanted her to know that he was okay now. Did you ever tell anyone? She hiccuped and tried her best to calm down before carrying on with their conversation. I couldn't tell my mom. If I told her, it would break her heart. Izuku, too, tried to calm down and prevent an outburst. No one had ever asked him so directly, and although he was shocked, he suddenly wanted to pour his heart out and come clean about everything. But he couldn't. An image of All Might flashed through his mind and he bit back the words that were at the tip of his tongue. That's so horrible. Uraraka's hands flew to her mouth. He couldn't stand seeing Uraraka so upset over something that had happened to him so many years ago. Don't worry, Uraraka-san. I am okay now. I have so many amazing friends now, and it feels like it would be a waste if I spent my time being sad and depressed when I could be with you guys instead and make new memories. My dream came true and I will be a hero, and I think that's much more important to think about. He reached over to put a hand on her arm, but Uraraka launched herself at him and hugged him so tightly that he almost couldn't breathe. When she finally let go of him, she had calmed down considerably. Was Bakugo your bully? Uraraka looked very uncomfortable at the prospect, and Izuku knew that she wasn't on the best of terms with the blonde. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't lie to Uraraka, who wore her heart on the sleeve. Izuku couldn't bring himself to admit it either, so he settled for a more cryptic response. It wasn't that bad. Kaken wasn't the only one. Crap, it sounded worse than he had thought it would. Uraraka's eyes widened and Izuku hastily tried to explain himself. I mean, kids say a lot of stuff without really meaning it. I think they all realized as we got older. He defended weakly. It was true that kids often said hurtful things in the spur of the moment, but that didn't mean they meant it or couldn't change their opinion as they got older. Kaken hadn't been that bad. He didn't understand things the same way others did, so it had led to many misunderstandings between them as the years progressed. Izuku had always admired the blonde boy and wanted to become like him, while Kaken had thought of his admiration as mockery. He's still a jerk and a bully, Uraraka said with finality in her voice. Izuku couldn't argue with her on that. Bakugo's personality and his foul mouth hardly left room for discussion. He's not so bad. Izuku tried to defend him anyways, but the look on Uraraka's face told him she wasn't convinced. His aspiration to become the #1 hero and his immense talent obviously didn't paint the whole picture, but to Izuku, who had witnessed Kaken's hardships, it was enough to tell him that the angry boy had grown up quite a bit. He harasses you for no reason, Uraraka pointed out, which made Izuku scratch his head in thought. I agree that he isn't exactly the friendliest guy at UA, but that's not the real Kaken. It's hard to believe, but Kaken is very smart and sensitive. He has learned that his actions and attitude has consequences. Izuku trailed off. He thought back to a conversation he had had with All Might a while ago. All Might had mentioned Kaken's growth following all the failures he had experienced and pointed out his incredible potential that was hindered by himself. Izuku knew a thing or two about failure, but people tended to forget that Kaken was human and had goals that sometimes fell to the ground. His hollow victory at the sports festival, his failed provisional exam, his bad attitude that made him a target for villains and led to his kidnapping, just to name a few. Kaken had been struggling for so long and people overlooked how much effort the blonde put in trying to achieve his goals. Deku-kun? Are you okay? Uraraka put a hand on his arm and snapped him out of his. Yes. Sorry. I'm sorry I brought up the bullying. Uraraka apologized. Her tears were dry now, but her eyes were a little red. Izuku was afraid that his expression had made her think he was reminded of his middle school days. It's okay. I've just never really spoken to anyone about it, so I don't know what to say. Truth be told, Izuku had been all too happy to put it all behind him and move forward. He should have expected to be asked about it at one point or another, but he was glad it was Uraraka who had been the one to bring it up. Izuku blamed his lack of sleep and emotional turmoil for being taken by surprise and getting overwhelmed by Uraraka's compassion. Hopefully he would be better prepared the next time around. Is that also why you haven't told anyone that your quirk developed late? The brunette regarded him carefully. She had wanted him to tell her more, but it was a heavy conversation to have and Deku seemed to genuinely be fine. She had to believe him when he said that he had put it behind him. Yeah, I guess so. It's a little embarrassing to have so poor control over your quirk when you are in high school, Izuku admitted and felt his cheeks flush for the umpteenth time that day. He obviously couldn't tell her about One for All, but this was as close to the truth as it got. I disagree. If it only developed recently, it is amazing that you've made it so far without being able to control it fully. Uraraka, always looking at the bright side, smiled. Besides, you work harder than anyone else to get to where you want, so I think you should cut yourself some slack. She added as an afterthought and laughed when he blushed. Thank you. For always supporting me. Izuku smiled shyly. He looked at Uraraka through his bangs and noticed her getting flustered. Why, you're welcome. Uraraka squeaked and covered her face in embarrassment, which puzzled Izuku. He was only telling the truth, which was that Uraraka had supported him since day one. He remembered how she had gone to present Mike to share her points with him after the entrance exam and how she had become his first friend at UA. She had teamed up with him at the sports festival when everyone else avoided him and she had rooted for him all the way. There was also the instance at the training camp where Izuku had been chasing after Kakin and Uraraka had torn her shirt in half to wrap up his wounded arms to lessen his pain. She hadn't refused him and told him to stop. Quite on the contrary, she had known that he would continue and only tried to make him a little less uncomfortable. Izuku knew that he could always go to her when he needed help. Oh my god. Uraraka's voice was high-pitched and Izuku realized he had said some of that put loud. He felt embarrassed all the way to his hair and hoped she hadn't heard everything. Izuku stared very intently at the ground, wanting a hole to open up and swallow him. As a feeble attempt to do some damage control, Izuku tried to explain himself, but found himself sitting alone on the bench when he turned to the brunette beside him. Uraraka-san? He called after her and heard her unintelligibly sounds. From above him? Looking up, Izuku saw Uraraka floating and rotating slowly. Her face was hidden under her hands and Izuku could barely understand what she was muttering. Not wanting her to get nauseous, Izuku activated full cowl and jumped up to grab Uraraka before she could float too far away. The brunette had curled in on herself so Izuku had to catch her under her legs and behind her back before he could safely bring her down. She squealed when Izuku pulled her close to his chest and landed effortlessly back on the ground. The last time he had caught her like this, it had been an imposter imitating her and Izuku actually felt silly for being relieved that she didn't transform into someone else again. Thank you. Uraraka whispered and peeked at him through the gaps in her hands. Her face was beet red and Izuku felt bad for embarrassing her like that. No problem. We should head back to the dorm before it gets late. Izuku had noticed the street lamps flickering on a little while ago and thought it would be better to get back before a rescue team was sent to retrieve them. Iida would probably scold them for being out so late if they didn't hurry back. Why, you can put me down now, Uraraka said and reminded Izuku that he was still carrying her bridal style. Apologizing profusely, he carefully lowered her to the ground and let go of her. On the way back they talked about what they would be revising the next day and tried to pretend they weren't both blushing.